It was well after midnight, and I was on the last stretch of a taxing CR cross-country drive. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, and the endless ribbon of light suddenly appeared behind me as I squinted at the rearview mirror, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Where had this truck come from? The highway had been empty for miles. Hi everyone, I'm the storyteller. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, subscribe to the channel and relax. I had been pushing myself to get home before dawn, but now that this truck was pressing down on me, I was wide awake. The cab was looming large in my mirror, impossibly close. I tapped my brakes in the hopes that the driver would take the hint and back off, but it seemed to inch even closer. "Come on, just pass me already," I muttered, easing over to the right lane. The truck perfectly matched my move, staying right on my tail. I could practically count the rivets on its grille. My heart began to race. I was alone on a deserted highway with a truck that seemed determined to run me off the road. My mind raced through possible explanations, each more unsettling than the last. Road rage, a drunk driver, or something worse. I pressed down on the accelerator and watched the speedometer climb to 70, 75, and 80 miles per hour. The truck kept pace effortlessly, never falling behind. I decided to pull over when I saw a sign for an upcoming rest stop, where there might be more people nearby, safety in numbers, right? As I got off, the truck followed, and I muttered curses to myself and shook my hands as I made my way down the dark, winding road to the rest area. The parking lot appeared, lit by a single flickering street light, and it was empty. I pulled into a spot close to the restroom building, killing the engine, and the truck's headlights blinded me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart thumping. Happened now, seconds passed, and then there was silence. The light behind me gradually disappeared, so I opened my eyes and looked around. The parking lot was deserted, with no truck or headlights, just darkness and the faint buzz of the street light overhead. I sat there frozen for what seemed like hours, trying to figure out what had happened and whether I had imagined it all. I was so tired that I finally plucked up the courage to exit my car, and the cool night air hitting my face helped me to clear my mind. As the adrenaline started to wear off, I decided to try to get some sleep in my car before continuing my journey. I reclined the seat and closed my eyes, but every time I started to fall asleep, I would jerk awake, certain that I had heard the rumble of an engine. The sky was just starting to lighten, and when I gave up on sleep, I realized that I needed coffee if I was going to make it the rest of the way. I walked a lap around the parking lot, half expecting the truck to reappear at any moment, but there was no sign that it had ever been there. My nerves were shot, and every car I saw in the distance made my heart race. About an hour later, I spotted a 24-hour diner just off the highway. The parking lot was half full, which was a welcome sight after the emptiness of the night. I pulled in desperate for coffee and human contact, and the bell above the door jingled as I started the car and pulled out of the rest stop, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the truck. I slid into a booth near the window as I walked in, and a few heads turned to stare at me before returning to their own conversations or plates of food. I was still able to watch my car on the highway beyond when a waitress came up with a coffee pot in hand. She asked, "Rough night?" observing my unkempt appearance as she filled my cup. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. You could say that I had a bit of a scare on the highway. She raised an eyebrow, and I hesitated, feeling silly. Sounding crazy, I started this truck that followed me for miles on my bumper, but when I pulled over at a rest stop, it simply disappeared. The waitress's face changed, and she looked around before leaning in closer. "You're not the first to come through here with a story like that," she said in a low voice. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she sighed, sliding into the seat across from me. "Over the past few months, we've had a few drivers stop in here, all shaken up about a truck that chased them. What do you think it means?" The waitress shrugged, but her eyes were serious. "I don't know, but there's been a string of robberies on that highway lately. Cars found abandoned, drivers missing. Police haven't been able to catch whoever's behind it." And I leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "Did they see who was driving it?" She shook her head. "That's the thing. No one ever sees a driver, and the truck always disappears without a trace. It was like something out of a nightmare trying to piece together a phantom truck, disappearing drivers, and unsolved robberies." I asked if anyone had reported this truck to the police, and she said that a few had, but there was no proof, and the truck kept disappearing. So let's just say the police aren't taking it too seriously. I sat back and processed the information, and while I was relieved that I wasn't the only one who had experienced this and that I wasn't going crazy, a bigger part of me was terrified of what was actually happening. As she got up to return to work, I thought, "Wait." I called after her. "You said there have been robberies and missing drivers, but I wasn't robbed. The truck didn't even stop when I pulled." The waitress must have noticed the fear in my eyes because she reached out and patted my hand. "Look, you made it here safe. That's what matters." I nodded, grateful for her kindness and the warning. "If you see that truck again, get somewhere public as quickly as you can." She walked away, leaving me alone with my cooling coffee and racing thoughts. I stayed at the diner much longer than I had planned, nursing cup after cup of coffee as I watched the sunrise fully. The normalcy of the morning rush helped ground me, reminding me that the world wasn't all dark highways and phantom trucks. I wondered why she turned back, a grim expression on her face. Perhaps you were lucky, or perhaps they were just scouting, learning your habits and reactions for next time. Road, I felt more in control, and the highway appeared less threatening in the daylight, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched and that the driver of that ghost truck was waiting for another chance somewhere out there. I made it home safely, but the experience stayed with me, and I started looking up highway robberies in the area in search of trends or clues. I even thought about telling the police about my experience, but I kept stopping short of what I could say that wouldn't sound completely insane. Weeks went by, and gradually the intensity of that night started to fade. I continued to avoid driving that section of the highway after dark, but the constant fear subsided and life continued. However, about a month after my encounter, I saw a news report that made my blood run cold. The driver was missing, and witnesses said they saw a large truck in the area just before the disappearance. As I stared at the TV screen, I couldn't help but wonder if I had really escaped that night, or had I just delayed the inevitable. The highway stretched out in front of me like a dark ribbon, cutting through the night, but now every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me flinch, and every truck that went by made my heart race. The once calm solitude of a late-night drive had been broken, replaced by a persistent, nagging fear. I knew one thing for sure. I would never again look at an empty highway the same way, because I now realized that sometimes those highways aren't as empty as they appear to be in the dead of night. We've been digging for hours, and the well should have been nothing but dirt for at least another 10 feet. I called down to my son Jake, who was working next to me in the hole. "Hey, grab the flashlight, will you? I think we hit something." But I had no idea that metallic clang would be the sound that changed everything I'd inherited. Things that lurk in the darkness don't always disappear when you turn to face them. Jake showed me the flashlight where my shovel struck the beam, which reflected off something smooth and metallic in stark contrast to the dark earth surrounding it. It was a fixer-upper, to put it mildly, but it was a chance for a fresh start after the divorce. Jake and I had thrown ourselves into the work, repairing the barn, fixing fences, and now digging a new well because the old one had run dry years ago and we needed water. If we were going to make a go of this place, Jake asked in a voice that was a mix of as we dug. The object started to take shape. I shrugged, already scraping away more dirt with my hands. "I don't know, buddy. Let's find out." It was a metal container about the size of a small suitcase. It looked old, its once shiny surface now pitted and corroded. My mind raced with possibilities. Was there a time capsule containing treasure, or was it just some farmer's trash thrown in a hole and forgotten? It took another hour of careful digging to bring the container out of the ground. I looked more closely at the container. It was sealed tightly with no obvious way to open it. A faded inscription was barely visible on one inside, but years of corrosion had made it illegible. Jake asked, practically bouncing with excitement. I hesitated, part of me wanting to call the police, or maybe a lawyer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the field, so we carried our find back to the barn, both of us silent, lost in our own thoughts about what might be inside under the harsh glare of the barn's floodlights. I said, "What if this was proof of something?" Curiosity won out, so I reached for a crowbar and stood back. It took some work, but eventually the lid opened and the smell hit us first, musty and damp. Inside, hidden behind layers of waxy paper, was a stack of documents and photos. I picked up the first one, holding it up to the light, and it showed a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, smiling at the camera. Based on her attire and hairstyle, I assumed it was from the 1960s. Sarah Milligan, 1964, was written in faded ink on the back. Jake looked over my shoulder and asked, "Who's that, Dad?" I shook my head and said, "I don't know," but as I said it, a nagging feeling began in the pit of my stomach. The name Milligan sounded familiar, but I couldn't place why, so we spent the next hour going through the box's contents. Letters, newspaper clippings, and a small leather-bound journal were among the other items. A yellowed newspaper clipping fell out of the journal, and the headline made my blood run cold. 3 months later, a local woman was still missing. I read the article quickly, my heart pounding, and it mentioned that Sarah Milligan had vanished from her family's farm in the summer of 1964. Despite a thorough search, no trace of her was ever found. The article said that Sarah's father, the farm's owner, was the main suspect but was never charged because there was insufficient evidence. Dad Jake's voice brought me back to the present, and I tried to keep my voice down while I looked at my son. "Jake, I think we just found evidence in a very old missing persons case." His eyes widened like a real mystery, and I nodded. My mind was racing, but I started gathering up the documents carefully so as not to disturb them too much. "We need to call the police." The next few hours were a blur, with deputies coming out to the farm, detectives, and a crime scene unit. Our peaceful little farmhouse became the center of a flurry of activity, and Jake and I were questioned separately, recounting and narrating how I put Jake to bed, his head full of excitement about our discovery, but I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, staring out at the darkened fields, wondering what had happened to Sarah Milligan and why her name sounded so suspicious. When things finally calmed down, it was past midnight. The box and its contents had been taken away as evidence, and we had been told not to discuss the case with anyone, as if we knew anyone to discuss it with. The following morning, I drove into town with the intention of doing some research on my own. The local library was small, but it had decades worth of town newspaper archives, so I spent hours poring over microfiche, reading everything I could about the Milligan case. Sarah was 23 when she vanished, engaged to be married, and her fiancé had reported her missing when she failed to show up for a date. Her father, James Milligan, was the last person to see her, and he claimed she had left the farm to run errands in town. In a matter of days, I left the library with the realization that, had my uncle been involved in Sarah's disappearance, I would have inherited not just a farm but also a sinister family secret. When I arrived home, a police car was in the driveway, and Detective Reeves, the lead investigator, was waiting for me. My uncle's name was James Milligan, and he had left me this farm with a growing sense of dread. I also realized why Sarah's name had sounded familiar. My mother had mentioned her once, years ago, a cousin who had vanished before I was born. As I got out of my truck, Collins said, "We need to talk." We sat at the same kitchen table where I had spent a restless night, and Detective Reeves didn't waste time on small talk. "We've identified the DNA on some of the items in the box," she said, staring into my eyes, "and it matches Sarah Milligan." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and then I asked, "Mr. Collins, did you know anything about this before you found that box?" "I firmly say no. My uncle gave me this farm 6 months ago, and I've never even met him." She raised an eyebrow, and I took a deep breath. Sarah's father, Detective Reeves, leaned back, surprised that I was related to the Milligans. I told him about the connection I'd only recently learned about at the library, and as I spoke, I could see the wheels turning in the detective's mind. "I'm going to be straight with you," she said, adding that this complicates things and we'll need to conduct a thorough search of the property. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The farm turned into a crime scene, with police and forensic teams searching every inch of the property. Jake and I moved into a motel in town, watching from a distance as our new home was torn apart in search of evidence. The story hit the local news, then went national, and all of a sudden our quiet little town was overrun with reporters and true crime enthusiasts who wanted to know about the situation. I nodded, feeling numb, but I knew that you and your son might need to find somewhere else to stay for a while. Jake was old enough to understand the basics of what was going on, and his initial excitement about solving a mystery had given way to a more somber understanding of the reality we were facing. Jake asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Dad, do you think Uncle James did it? Do you think he killed Sarah?" I pulled him close, wishing I had a secret. Mysterious box about Sarah Milligan, about the farmer who'd inherited a decades-old secret. Better answer, "I'm not sure, buddy." As the investigation continued, more information surfaced. Old case files were reopened, witnesses were re-interviewed, and the picture that surfaced was a depressing one. Sarah had wanted to leave the farm to start a life with her fiancé, James Milligan, who had opposed the marriage and wanted Sarah to stay and help run the family business. However, there was no confession or smoking gun, just a lot of circumstantial evidence, and the family was finally split apart by suspicion and secrets after almost 2 months. We were permitted to return to the farm because the police had not discovered any additional evidence, and as long as the investigation was ongoing, they had no justification for preventing us from returning home. The farm felt different now, with every rustle in the field and creaking floorboards seeming to whisper long-buried secrets. As we got back into our routines, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were living in the shadow of a tragedy, and the farm that was supposed to be. I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what happened to Sarah Milligan, but I do know that her story and the secrets of this farm are now a part of our lives, and somehow we'll find a way to live with that, to honor her memory while building our own future on this. Our fresh start now felt tainted, haunted by the echoes of the past, but we stayed partly because we had nowhere else to go and partly because we felt we owed it to Sarah to discover the truth and bring her story to light after so many years of silence. It began as a fun road trip, a chance for Emily and me to reconnect after a difficult period in our relationship. We had planned a route from New York to California, mapping out quirky roadside attractions. Now, every time I pick up a shovel, I can't help but wonder what other secrets might be buried beneath our feet and whether some things are better left undiscovered. The first time I saw the blue sedan, I didn't think much of it, but by the third time, my palms were sweating on the steering wheel, and by the fifth time, I was fighting the urge to scream. And picturesque views along the way, but 3 days of our carefree adventure had turned into a nightmare. We had stopped for gas just outside of Chicago when I first saw the car, a plain blue sedan that was likely a Toyota or Honda with tinted windows that prevented me from seeing the driver. As I filled up our tank, I watched it pull into the pump across from us. Nothing out of the ordinary, but 2 hours later, we stopped for lunch at a diner in the middle of nowhere, and there it was again, parked a few spaces down. I nudged Emily and nodded. As we ate our hamburgers, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone watching us, but the car just sat there silent and empty. We hit the road again, and for a while, I was able to relax. We sang along to our road trip playlist, played silly car games, and marveled at the car. Is it just me, or did we see that same car at the gas station? She squinted, then shrugged. Maybe it's a pretty common car, though it's probably just a coincidence. The changing landscape as we pushed west, but as the sun started to set and we pulled into a small town to find a motel for the night, my blood ran cold. I said in a tight voice, the only motel in town is the blue sedan MEM. She followed my gaze, and I saw the moment realization dawn on her face. Okay, that's a little weird. She hurried to our room with our bags after checking the door lock twice, and when I looked out through the curtains, the blue car was still there. Emily asked in a small voice if we should call the police because the windows were reflecting the neon glow of the motel sign. I hesitated and told them that we had seen the same car 3 times in one day. They would think we were paranoid because we had spent a restless night taking turns keeping watch, but nothing happened. When morning arrived, the blue car was gone. I wanted to think that maybe we had just been paranoid, but as we merged onto the highway, my heart fell because there were a few cars behind us in the familiar blue shape we had seen before. The blue car followed me as I abruptly took the next exit, causing a chorus of honks from other drivers. I turned down side streets at random, trying to be unpredictable, and after an hour of this cat and mouse game, we found ourselves on a lonely stretch of country road with fields of corn stretched out on either side. Need to lose them, I said, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, and Emily nodded, her face pale. Only by the farmhouse or barn, what do we do now? Emily asked in a trembling voice, and I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, I saw something that made my heart jump into my throat. Up ahead, an old barn with faded red paint peeling in the sun was looming by the roadside, and behind it, just visible, was a blue sedan. Emily's eyes widened in fear, so I turned around and slammed on the brakes, ready to spin the car around, but it was too late. When the barn blocked the road ahead, I saw another car appear in my rearview mirror, cutting off our retreat. Tom seemed to slow down, but then a figure stepped out of the blue sedan's driver's door, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. No, Emily was breathing next to me, but it was walking towards our car with a grim smile on its face. My memories of Emily's ex-boyfriend Mark came flooding back. I had tried to hide the fact that Emily had shown up at my apartment 6 months prior, bruised and scared, and made a tearful confession about when Mark approached the driver's side window. I pressed the lock button for all the good it would do. He leaned down, his face inches from the glass for a long time without seeing, his voice muffled but still chilling. Did you really think you could just run away? Emily was frozen next to me, her face a mask of terror. Mark's violent outbursts and possessive behavior, the restraining order we'd helped her get, and the weeks of watching over our shoulders and jumping at every sound we thought were over. What do you want, Mark? I called through the glass, trying to keep my voice steady, and his smile widened, showing too many teeth. I want what's mine. He said, I know you're breaking the restraining order just by being here, and his face darkened. You don't know anything about us or about what we had, I said, and you think I care about some piece of paper you think can keep me away from her. Emily trembled next to him. I knew I needed to do something to get us out of this, but how did I do it? The car behind us, the one that had been following us earlier, wasn't one I recognized, and the driver looked unsure. A desperate, possibly foolish plan started to form in my mind, but it was all we had, Emily. I whispered to Mark, keeping my eyes on him, Go, I need you to duck down. Can you do that? She nodded, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. I took a deep breath, then quickly turned the ignition key and slammed the Mark yelled in anger as he ran towards us, but I was already shifting into drive, cutting the wheel hard, and we fishtailed onto the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we might flip, but the tires caught and we shot forward. I didn't look back, I just drove. I yelled, Emily ducked, and I floored it, and our car shot backwards straight towards the car behind us. At the last second, I saw the driver's eyes widen and swerve, narrowly avoiding a collision. We drove for hours, taking random turns, avoiding main roads, and every car we saw made us cringe. Every time we had to stop for gas, we scanned the area obsessively. It was well past midnight when we finally felt safe enough to stop. Emily sat up slowly, her face pale. Are they following us? I asked, not daring to take my eyes off the road. She turned in her seat, peering out the back window. I don't think so. I can't see them. I didn't slow down. Collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and shell-shocked. How did he find us? Emily whispered into the darkness. I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. I don't know, maybe he hacked your phone or something. We'll get new ones tomorrow. She was silent for a while, and her voice finally broke. I'm so sorry, she said. I turned to her and pulled her close, saying, Hey, this isn't your fault at all, it's all on him. She buried her face in my shoulder, her body trembling. He'd been able to follow us this far, but who knew how long he could keep it up? As the first rays of dawn started to peek through the curtains, I decided we were going to disappear. Emily looked up at me, her eyes puffy and red. What do you mean? I mean, we're going to become different people with new names and new identities, and we'll go somewhere he'd never be able to go. I held her in silence while I wondered what we were going to do. I don't know if we'll ever truly be free of Mark, and I don't know if we'll ever stop looking over our shoulders, but I do know that we're in this together, and together we'll find a way to survive the open road stretches. Emily was silent for a long time, but slowly she nodded. Okay, let's do it. So, as the sun rose on a new day, we started planning our vanishing act. Our road trip had turned into an escape route that would take us not to California but to a whole new life. There are a lot of possibilities and dangers ahead of us, but for now, at least we're free. The last time I saw Eliza Thompson, she was laughing, and I can still clearly remember the image of her head thrown back, her long, dark hair catching the golden light of the sunset, and the sound of her joy being carried away by the sea breeze. Little did I know at the time that this would be the last time I would ever see her, and that she would disappear without a trace in less than 12 hours. My name is Michael Chin, and I was a security officer on board the Emerald Princess, a luxury cruise ship sailing the Caribbean. It was my third year on the job, and I thought I'd seen it all: drunken fights, small-time theft, the odd medical emergency, but Eliza's disappearance was something else entirely. It began like any other day, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow us all. I'm getting ahead of myself. I started working at sea at 6 a.m. As I was moving through the ship's public spaces and corridors, I noticed that most of the passengers were still asleep in their cabins. As I passed the grand atrium, I nodded to Eliza, who was wrapping up her night shift at the reception desk. "Good morning, Michael," she said, suppressing a yawn. "Anything exciting planned for today?" I shrugged as usual. "You should get some rest. You look beat," she laughed. Gathering her belongings, she said, "Oh, I will, but first I'm going to watch the sunrise from my." Eliza closed her eyes and breathed in the salty air as the sky gradually lightened. "I love this," she said softly. "No matter how many cruises I work, this never gets old." I watched her out of the corner of my eye and was struck by how serene she looked. "Favorite spot on the upper deck? Want to join me?" I hesitated because I was on duty, but it was a quiet morning, so sure, why not? I could use some fresh air there. She opened her eyes and smiled wistfully as I asked, "How long have you been working on cruise ships?" It was supposed to be just a gap year after college, but I fell in love with it, the travel, the people, the sense of adventure. I nodded, fully understanding that this was why I'd stayed with this job too, despite the long hours and time away from home. At that moment, I realized there was still a lot about her that I didn't know. The rest of my shift went smoothly until that evening during the nightly staff meeting when I realized something was amiss. Eliza wasn't there, and our supervisor, Rita, asked, frowning at her clipboard, "Has anyone seen Thompson?" Eliza yawned again as the sun crept above the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I should really get some sleep," she said, adding, "Thanks for the company, Michael. See you later." I nodded as she walked away, realizing that this was the last time I would see her alive. She was supposed to start her shift an hour ago, and there were mutterings of confusion going around the room. It wasn't like Eliza to be late, much less miss a shift entirely. I saw her this morning, and I offered that she was going to her cabin to sleep after the night shift. Rita's frown deepened, so I nodded, and as I headed to the crew quarters, I knocked on Eliza's door, calling her name, but she didn't answer. I used my master key to enter, half expecting to find her sound asleep. The cabin appeared to be untouched since this morning. There was a lengthy pause before Rita responded and started the search procedure. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as we combed every inch of the ship, from the engine room to the uppermost decks, reviewed security footage, spoke with crew members, and more. Eliza's evening shift uniform was neatly laid out on a chair, and her phone was on the nightstand with its screen dark. Passengers, but Eliza was nowhere to be seen. The last verified sighting of her was at 7:12 a.m. on the security video outside her cabin. It appeared as though she had simply disappeared into thin air as the night wore on and our search produced nothing. The atmosphere on the ship became tense as passengers noticed the increased security presence and began whispering among themselves. The footage showed her entering her room and closing the door behind her. We had to face the reality that we had a missing person in the morning. The captain announced that he was looking for any information regarding Eliza's whereabouts, and her picture was shown on screens throughout the ship. We called the closest port authorities and the cruise line's headquarters, and a Coast Guard search was started, even though we all knew that there was very little chance of finding anyone in the vast Caribbean. I couldn't help but feel that I was somehow at fault if I had escorted her to her cabin that morning. As the investigation intensified, I found myself telling a stern-faced detective from the ship's security team every detail of my last encounter with Eliza. Did she seem anxious or distracted? Did she mention any plans for the day? He asked, and I shook my head when he asked. No, she seemed happy and relaxed and was looking forward to getting some sleep. The detective's eyes narrowed, and you're sure she went into her cabin? There's no way she could have left without being seen on camera, according to the security footage. He nodded and made a note in his file. I hesitated, thinking it couldn't be possible because the corridor outside the crew cabins is monitored around the clock, but as I said it, a shiver went down my spine because, if it couldn't have happened, how had the mystery deepened? Days went by, and a thorough search of Eliza's cabin turned up nothing unusual, including her passport, wallet, and all personal belongings. There were no signs of Eliza had been happy, with no signs of depression or distress, so there was no evidence of foul play. However, there were many theories among the crew and passengers that she had somehow fallen overboard, though it was unclear how she could have done so without anyone noticing. Others whispered about suicide, but those who knew her dismissed this completely. The most unsettling theory that kept me up at night was that someone on the ship was responsible for her disappearance. Be a killer. Walking among us was nearly too horrific to imagine. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation ran into dead ends one after the other. The ship finished its planned cruise and went back to Pori so that more thorough forensic work could be done, but despite the full force of law enforcement, no new leads surfaced. Eliza's family flew in their faces, filled with anxiety and sorrow. I watched from a distance as the investigators briefed them and saw the mother break down in tears as the truth of the case as the situation set in. I wanted to go up to them and offer some consolation, but what could I say? Ultimately, the Emerald Princess set sail again, with a new crew member replacing Eliza at the reception desk. Life on board resumed as usual, or at least in part, but for those of us who had known her and had looked for her, who had been left with nothing but questions, things would never be the same. I stayed with the cruise line because I couldn't leave while Eliza's fate remained unknown, and every new port offered a glimmer of hope that sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I find myself on deck 16 staring out at the endless expanse of the sea. I think about Eliza and how she used to laugh about how much she loved watching the sunrise. I wonder where she is and if she's still out there somewhere. I have the feeling that the ocean knows the truth and holds its secrets in its unfathomable depths. Some hint would appear that someone somewhere might have seen something, but as months went by without any new information, that hope started to fade. In my opinion, Eliza Thompson's unsolved mystery and ghost story, which cruise ship crews whisper among themselves, serve as a constant reminder of how easily a life can disappear without a trace. Every time I watch a security camera feed or see a passenger enter their cabin, I can't help but wonder, could it happen again in this floating city of steel and glass surrounded by the vast, uncaring sea? Are any of us really safe? The Emerald Princess sails on, carrying its cargo of tourists and secrets, and somewhere the first slash in the tent canvas was so precise and surgical that it almost appeared intentional. I ran my finger along the edge, feeling the frayed nylon threads, and as the fading daylight filtered through that precise cut, casting long shadows across the abandoned campsite. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a bear attack. Perhaps Eliza is still laughing out there, her voice carried away by the endless ocean breeze. My name is Alex, and I've been a seasoned backpacker accustomed to the difficulties of long-distance trekking. My best friend Jamie and I have been hiking the Appalachian Trail for the past month. However, nothing from our years of outdoor adventures could have prepared us for what we discovered in that remote clearing deep within the Georgia wilderness. The day had begun like any other on the trail, with us setting up camp at dawn in the hopes of covering at least 15 miles before nightfall. The weather was ideal, cool and crisp, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs at bay. It was late afternoon when Jamie noticed the first indication that something was wrong. "Hey, Alex," he called, pointing to a tree just off the trail. "Check this out." I walked over and squinted at the trunk, where carved deep into the bark was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. The cuts looked fresh and the exposed wood was still oozing sap. I muttered, "I've never seen a trail marker like that before." Jamie shrugged, "Probably just some kid playing around." As the sun started to set, we began searching for a suitable campsite. When we arrived, we realized we weren't the first to find this clearing, which was a small level area nestled between two rocky outcroppings with a babbling stream nearby. The forest seemed quieter than usual. The usual chorus of bird song and insect was oddly muted, and I could have sworn I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just out of sight. Idyllic location, the remnants of a campsite lay in front of us as if its occupants had disappeared in the middle of their stay. A tent stood in the middle, its door open and swaying gently in the breeze, and a small cooking pot sat on a makeshift fire pit among the ashes. Jimmy and I looked at each other, but it wasn't normal. Even the messiest campers usually pack up before moving on. Jamie called out to everyone here, and his voice reverberated through the campsite. A flashlight was lying on its side, its beam casting eerie shadows on a small notebook, which I picked up and flipped open to reveal the inside of the ruined shelter. The clearing was only interrupted by the gentle gurgle of the stream and the rustle of leaves above. As we cautiously approached, I noticed the first slash in the tent, followed by another and another. The entire structure was covered in them, each cut deliberate and precise. What the hell was I breathing? Day 3. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and it's still out there. The others think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. It's not a bear. It's not anything natural. And God help us if it gets in. I showed Jamie the notebook, and as the color faded from his face, he said, "We should go." His voice was barely above a whisper, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something half hidden beneath a torn sleeping bag. A camera. My hand shook as I picked it up, praying. I dropped the camera, stumbling backwards, and as I turned, I realized with horror that the sun had almost set. The battery wasn't dead, and the screen flickered to life, showing the last image I took, and my heart almost stopped. The photo was dark, obviously taken at night, but just at the edge of the frame, illuminated by the flash, there was something that looked almost human but not quite, with long, spindly limbs, a face that was more shadow than substance, and eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a gigantic cat. Jamie was already gathering his pack as the forest around us deepened into twilight shadows, lengthening and merging into an impenetrable gloom. He said in a tense voice, "We can make it back to the trail if we hurry." I nodded and grabbed my own backpack, but as I turned to go, I noticed a small silver locket half buried in the soft earth near the fire pit. Without thinking, I scooped it up and shoved it in my pocket. We started at a brisk pace, attempting to retrace our steps. Jamie panted as we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, but nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers more than once. I thought I heard something moving in the underbrush, but it was always just out of sight. Do you remember that strange symbol we saw earlier? I think I saw another one right there, carved into a massive oak. It was the same circle and line symbol we had seen earlier, but it looked older. It's probably just a coincidence, I said, not believing myself. Come on, we need to keep moving, I said. But as we continued, more symbols appeared. Some were new while others were old, and they seemed to be leading us to something I couldn't say. The darkness was almost complete, and now our headlamps were creating little islands of light in a sea of darkness. The forest was now completely silent, save for the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and the increasingly ragged sound of our breathing, which is when we heard it. A low, this guttural sound, which sounded somewhere between a growl and a moan, seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jamie froze, and I shook my head, unable to speak. My instinct told me to run, but I knew that panicking now would only make us more lost. So we pushed on, moving as quietly as we could. However, the sounds kept getting closer, and then I saw a flicker of movement just ahead of me. A tall, impossible-to-thin shape slipped between two trees and threw a fleeting glimpse of my headlamp. I saw pale, elongated legs and a face that was little more than a dark void with pinpricks of reflected light where eyes should be. I yelled, forgetting all thoughts of stealth, and we crashed through the undergrowth, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots threatened to trip us at every step. The sounds behind us grew louder, a cacophony of inhuman shrieks and growls. I'm not sure how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours, but miraculously we burst out onto we staggered towards the park ranger station on a wide gravel road, gasping for air, and as we reached the door, I had the opportunity to glance back at the forest from which we had just fled. At the edge of the trees, a tall, impossibly thin figure with limbs that seemed too long for its body raised a hand that looked more like a claw than a human appendage, and for a brief moment, I thought it would pursue us into the light, but it turned and disappeared again, melting back into the shadows of the forest. In the days that followed, as Jimia and I recovered in a nearby town, I thought of that silver locket I'd pocketed in my panic. The Rangers were doubtful of our story, of course, and blamed our experience on exhaustion, dehydration, and an overactive imagination. Nevertheless, they sent out a search party to investigate the abandoned campsite, but they found nothing. No slashed tent, no scattered gear, not even a trace of a campfire. I never reported finding the locket because I knew that doing so would only lead to more questions that I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Jamie and I never completed our hike by unwritten agreement. We packed up and went home, ending our adventure on the Appalachian Trail. We don't talk much about what happened in those woods, but occasionally on dark nights when the wind whispers, I had the guts to open it and discovered a small photo inside that showed a smiling family. Mother, father, and two children, posing in front of a familiar-looking clearing. The scream that ripped through the cab of my truck that night wasn't human. No one could have made a sound like that, raw, primal, and filled with a terror so deep it made my blood run cold. But it came from the man sitting next to me, the hitchhiker. As I think about that abandoned campsite and what we saw in the forest, I wonder with a chill that goes bone deep if somewhere out there in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness it's thinking about us too. I'm Jack, and I've been driving big rigs across the country for the better part of 20 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things out on the lonely highways. Ghost lights, inexplicable weather, and even the occasional UFO if you catch me after a few beers. I knew with sickening certainty that whatever had just happened or whatever he'd seen in his dreams was far from over when his eyes flew open and reflected the dashboard lights like some wild animal. I'm not usually one to pick faults, but I was about halfway through Nevada when I noticed a lone figure standing by the side of the road, thumb out. If it had started as a routine haul Phoenix to Seattle with a trailer full of electronics, I was having a great time, the miles melting away under my wheels as I cruised through the desert night. The radio kept me company, playing a mix of old country tunes and late-night talk shows about conspiracy theories and alien abductions. Something about this guy made me slow down. Perhaps it was the lost look in his eyes or the way he braced himself against the chill desert wind. But whatever it was, before I knew it, I was pulling over where you were going. I called out as he approached anywhere, But here, he replied in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. I should have moved on at that point, but instead I found myself saying, "Hop in. I'm going to Seattle if that works for you." "I'm Jack," I said, pulling back onto the highway. Mike replied without looking at me, "Thanks for the ride." We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. I tried to strike up a conversation a few times, but Mike's responses were at best monosyllabic, and eventually I gave up, focusing on the road ahead. He smelled of dust and something else I couldn't quite place up close. He looked young, maybe in his mid-20s, with shaggy brown hair and eyes that seemed to dart nervously around the cab. About an hour later, I saw that Mike had fallen asleep with his head leaning against the window. I turned the radio down a notch so as not to wake him, but that's when things started to get strange. It started with a slight twitch of his hand, then his breathing became shallow and rapid, and his eyes began moving frantically behind closed lids as if he was in the middle of a very intense dream. I was about to wake him because I was afraid he might be having a fit, but it was too low to hear him muttering at first. Quickly became louder. "No, no, please don't let it find me." His voice was full of pure, unadulterated fear. "Hey buddy," I said, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "Wake up, you're having a nightmare." But instead of waking up, his muttering became more frantic, and his body began to thrash in the seat. "It's coming, oh God, it's coming," he said, and then his eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. Like some nocturnal animal, it reflected the green glow of the dashboard. I was able to stop, and Mike snapped out of it. He turned to face me, but his eyes seemed to be seeing something else. Beyond me, it followed me, and he whispered, "Ah, God, Jack," it followed me into the truck. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What followed you, Mike? There's nothing here but us." He shook his head violently, and his eyes darted around. Mike stood a few feet away from the truck, arms wrapped around himself, shaking like a leaf. I said, "Come on, Mike," approaching him slowly like you would a frightened animal. "What's going on? What do you think is following you?" He turned to me. "We have to get out now," before I could stop him. He had thrown open the passenger door and leaped out into the night. I cursed and fumbled with my seatbelt before following him. I'm not sure what it is, but it's been chasing me for days since I discovered that thing in the desert. When I asked Mike what it was, he reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and took out what appeared to be a small stone, but as he held it up, I realized it wasn't a stone at all, but rather some sort of artifact carved with intricate symbols I had never seen before. In the harsh glare of the headlights, the symbols appeared to shimmer and change as if they were moving. The thing that lives in the spaces between the things that hunt in dreams wants this back, Mike said, gesturing vaguely at the dark expanse of desert surrounding us in some sort of old ruin. I thought it might be worth something, and he laughed bitterly. I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer, but Mike's eyes met mine with a terror that made my blood run cold. He held up the artifact, and it wants me to take it. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that Mike shook his head frantically. I've tried, but it doesn't work like that. It's like it's attached to me now, and the only way to get rid of it is to pass it on to someone else to make them take it. I had a nightmare that there was no monster hunting him, but the conviction in his voice and the raw fear in his eyes made it impossible to dismiss. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Okay, so why don't we just give it back, throw that thing away, and be done with it? A shiver went down my spine when I realized what he was saying. I'm so sorry, but I can't take it anymore. The dreams and visions are driving me crazy. I took a step back, suddenly realizing how alone we were out here in the desert night. Mike, I won't take that thing, please. He begged, holding out the artifact. I can't do this anymore. Just take it, you'll see, you'll understand for a moment. He nodded. Why were you hitchhiking? He tried to give it to someone else, swirling in a mesmerizing dance, but I quickly snapped out of it and shook my head, saying, no, I won't do it, Mike, but I'll help you. We'll figure this out together. Mike stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, and then slowly nodded, okay, whispering, okay, we'll try. We got back in the truck, the artifact safely wrapped in a cloth and stowed in the glove compartment. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had. I don't know what happened to Mike, but after I dropped him off in Reno, he said he was going to find an expert who could help him get rid of the artifact for good. I gave him my number and made him promise to call and let me know he was okay. It's been 3 months, and occasionally on long night drives through, I haven't heard from him. The night seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and more than once I thought I saw something moving just at the edge of my headlights. In the desert, I find myself looking at the side of the road, half expecting to see him standing there with his thumb out. Occasionally, between sleeping and waking, I see tall, twisted shapes with too many eyes in the shadows of my room. I tell myself that this is just my imagination, the after effects of that strange night, but deep down I know that whatever was hunting Mike that night, whatever existed in his dreams, it's out there still waiting and watching. My heart raced as I skimmed the faded, spidery handwriting, realizing that this was no ordinary farm ledger. The words human subject and genetic manipulation jumped out at me, and I realized with increasing horror that I'd been watching it too. The leather-bound journal fell open in my hands, its yellowed pages releasing a musty cloud of dust and decay. At first, I thought it was just another relic of the farm's long history, perhaps a record of crop yields or livestock lineages. Discovered something much darker than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know that this discovery would force me to reevaluate everything I believed to be true about the peaceful rural world around me. My name is Sam, and I had only been working at Willow Creek Farm for about a month when I came across the journal. I had just graduated from Cal College with a degree in agriculture and aspirations of one day owning my own farm, so I seized the opportunity to work on a farm and for old Mr. Harrison. The experience was the vast, somewhat dilapidated property with its weathered barns and endless fields had a certain charm. Mr. Harrison was a quiet, fair, and gruff man who lived alone in the large farmhouse. His wife had long since passed away and his children had moved to the city. He didn't discuss much about the history of the farm. Instead, he gave me my daily responsibilities and left me to work on fixing fences, caring for the small herd of cattle, and helping to plant and harvest the crops. It was a hot, muggy afternoon in late July when Mr. Harrison Mose danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards, and the air was thick with the smell of old hay and something else chemical that I couldn't quite place. He asked me to clear out one of the old barns, something he had been meaning to do for years. He had complained that he might as well put you to use on it. Just pile up anything that looks worth keeping and haul the rest to the burn pile. The barn was a cavernous structure, and its interior was dim and cool in contrast to the intense heat outside. Sorting through piles of moldering sacks of feed, broken furniture, and rusted farm equipment was a tedious task. As I carried item after item to the expanding pile outside, I noticed a loose floorboard. I might have missed it completely if my boot hadn't caught on the edge, almost sending me sprawling. Curious, I knelt down to inspect it. The board moved easily under my hands, and as I lifted it, I noticed a small space underneath that was just large enough to conceal something. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth and was surprisingly well preserved considering its hiding place. I pulled it out and looked over my shoulder guiltily, even though I knew Mr. Harrison was off in the fields. It felt intrusive to read someone else's private thoughts, but my curiosity quickly turned to confusion and then to horror when I realized it belonged to a Dr. Elliot Harrison, dated 1954. Mr. Harrison's father, I realized, but the pages described intricate scientific experiments, so this was no typical farmer. Dr. Harrison wrote about his attempts to use genetic manipulation to create more resilient and productive livestock, but it wasn't just animals he was testing on. There were also detailed notes about human subjects and hazy references to volunteers from the local asylum. As I turned the pages, my hands trembled and I read about failed experiments with creatures that weren't entirely human or animal sketches that made me sick, and throughout it all, I felt a growing sense of the doctor's the final entry, dated 1963, was different. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. The experiment was successful, but at what cost? They're now hiding in the fields and woods, scratching at the walls at night. God forgive me for what I've created. I snapped the journal shut, my heart pounding. This must be some sort of sick joke, right? Or perhaps the ramblings of a madman there. I pushed the journal back into its hiding place because I felt like I needed to leave this barn to get some fresh air and clear my head. There was no way any of this could be real, but even as I tried to reason it, memories of strange things that had happened around the farm started to come back to me. The strange noises I had heard at night were dismissed as wildlife, and the parts of the property that Mr. Harrison had warned me to avoid were the way the cattle occasionally seemed spooked by something I couldn't see. "Sam, you look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I managed to say, "just it's hot in there, needed some air." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "Don't work too hard. Come on up to the house when you're done. I'll fix us some dinner," he asked, glancing at the pile of junk I'd accumulated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Did he know about the journal, about what his father had done? That night, as I lay in bed in the tiny apartment above the garage that Mr. Harrison had given me, I couldn't sleep because every rustle from the fields outside and every creak of the old building made me nervous. I kept thinking about the journal, about the creatures Dr. Harrison had written about, and whether they were still alive after all these years. I couldn't reconcile the kind, gruff old man I knew with the dark history I just discovered. Was he carrying on his father's work, or was he just as much a victim of it as anyone else? I bolted upright when I heard a strange, guttural sound that was unlike anything I had ever heard before, my heart pounding. I crept to the window and looked out into the darkness, thinking nothing at first, but then I noticed something moving in the field beyond the barn. It was large and definitely not a cow, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. Then it turned and I caught a glimpse of its face in the moonlight. I staggered back from the window, biting back a scream at what I had seen. Animal or something in between that shouldn't be there. I spent the rest of the night curled up in my bed, listening to the sounds of movement outside. When dawn finally came, I was tired but relieved that everything would make sense again in the light of day. However, as the days went by, strange things started to happen more frequently. Tools would disappear and then reappear in strange places. The cattle became more agitated, especially at night, and I repeatedly caught Mr. Harrison staring off into the woods with a distressed face. I considered packing up and leaving Willow Creek Farm as soon as possible, but something stopped me, perhaps curiosity or a sense of duty, because whatever Dr. Harrison had done or created was still out there. And perhaps there was something I could do about it. I started my own research carefully at first, going over the journal again and taking notes in an effort to comprehend the science underlying his experiments. I then ventured into the far reaches of the property. The experiments had continued, passed down from father to son, and Mr. Harrison wasn't just aware of what his father had done, he was trying to fix it. It all came to an end one stormy night in late August when I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and Mr. Harrison's cries. I hurried to the farmhouse, the rain beating down on my face, and discovered the front door splintered and broken. Mr. Harrison had instructed me to avoid certain areas in order to avoid searching for signs of the creatures, and I began to piece together the truth gradually. The scene was chaotic, with furniture overturned, claw marks scoring the wall, and Mr. Harrison standing in the middle of the living room facing a creature that defied description. It was part human, part animal, with a patchwork of mismatched parts on its body and eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. Mr. Harrison yelled at me when he saw the syringe on the mantel. Without thinking, I grabbed it and threw it to Mr. Harrison in one fluid motion. Mr. Harrison sank to his knees, his face a mask of relief and exhaustion, and he murmured, "It's finally over." In the days that followed, Mr. Harrison told me everything about how his father's experiments had produced a few hybrid creatures, how they thrashed wildly for a moment before collapsing to the floor, its body appearing to melt and reform before my eyes. Eventually, all that was left was an unconscious, very human-looking man. Although the long nightmare was finally over, the dark legacy of Willow Creek Farm would always be with me. I still worked the farm with Mr. Harrison, and we never mentioned that night to anyone who would believe us, but occasionally on calm nights when the wind whispers through the corn, he would occasionally venture out to terrorize the farm while hiding in the woods for decades. He had spent his life trying to find a cure, a way to undo what his father had done. The secrets of Willow Creek Farm are now buried as they should be, but the lessons about responsibility and the unintended consequences of our actions will always be with me. I'll never look at a quiet rural farm quite the same way again because the footprints ended abruptly in the fields. I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if we truly found them all. I can't help but think about the thin line between scientific progress and playing God, and how easy it is to cross that line with the best of intentions. The middle of the field as though their owner had just disappeared into thin air. I stood there with my flashlight in hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, because in my 20 years on the force, I had never seen anything like this. The car was still running, the keys were in the ignition, and the driver's personal belongings were undamaged. It seemed as though the driver had left the vehicle for a brief moment and then simply vanished. Little did I know that the seemingly routine call would lead me down a rabbit hole of unexplainable events and unsolved mysteries that would what happened that night on a desolate stretch of Highway 50 deep in the heart of what locals refer to as the loneliest road in America began as a routine night shift, and I was cruising along the highway with more tumbleweed than traffic keeping me awake. My name is Sarah Jennings, and I have been a state trooper in Nevada for 20 years. I thought I had seen it all: high-speed chases, horrific accidents, even the occasional UFO report from some poor soul who had been out in the desert heat for too long. When the company received a call about an abandoned car on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking, I decided to check it out, call a tow if needed, and head out. As I pulled up behind the car, which was a late model sedan, I noticed something strange. The engine was still running. I approached cautiously, one hand on my holster out of habit, and the driver's side door was slightly open, but there was no sign of the driver. I looked inside with my flashlight and found nothing unusual. Normal, with a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder, a phone charging on the dashboard, a duffel bag in the back seat, and no indications of a struggle or blood. I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the area to see if anyone was there, including the highway patrol. Only the whisper of the desert wind responded, and that's when I noticed a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's side door into the field next to the highway. They were clear and intentional, not the staggered tracks of someone hurt, or I radioed in my predicament and started to follow the prints. The field was primarily made up of bare scrub brush, and hard-packed earth, making it easy to see the trail with my flashlight. I thought the driver would be letting themselves out behind a bush or perhaps have wandered off in confusion, but instead I found nothing. The footprints stopped abruptly about 50 yards into the field. One moment they were there as clear as day, and the next, nothing, just undisturbed earth stretching out into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, my mind refusing to despite the cool night air. I was perspiring by the time backup arrived. My colleague Mike looked at my face and knew something was wrong. "What have we got, Sarah?" he asked, his hand automatically moving to his body. I searched the area thoroughly, widening my circle, looking for any signs of disturbance. Nothing, no scuff marks to indicate someone had jumped or been lifted, no signs of a struggle, just those footprints ending in the middle of nowhere. We called in forensics, had the area cordoned off, and the next few hours were a blur of activity as we took pictures, took casts of the footprints, searched the car, and identified the driver as one David Chin, 37, a software engineer from San Francisco. His family was contacted, but he followed me out into the field, his confusion growing with each step. "This is weird," he said, finally standing at the end of the trail. David Chin had simply disappeared, leaving behind a running car and a set of footprints that led nowhere. In the days that followed, the investigation grew more intense. Search parties searched the area, helicopters used thermal imaging to scan for miles around, and David's phone records, bank statements, and internet history were examined. They hadn't heard from him, yes, but he was driving to visit them in Denver, and he had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior as dawn broke, seeing long shadows across the field. I tried to remain grounded and concentrate on the facts, but the more I researched the case, the stranger things became. Missing persons bulletins were sent out in several states, but there was no clue as to what had happened to David Chin. Theories were numerous, each more bizarre than the last. Some claimed he had been kidnapped by criminals, cult members, aliens, or secret government experiments involving portals to other dimensions. A week after David vanished, I received an anonymous tip. The caller, whose trembling voice was covered by some sort of modulator, told me to investigate something called the Highway of Tears. At first, I thought it was just another crackpot lead, but something about the caller's urgency kept me awake that night. I began researching, and what I discovered chilled me to my core. It turned out that the Highway of Tears wasn't just one highway, but a phenomenon that had been reported across multiple states and even several countries. It was a phenomenon where people had disappeared without a trace, frequently leaving behind. The more I dug, the more cases I discovered that mirrored David's, a truck driver in Australia who disappeared while making a routine delivery, footprints leading into the snow before abruptly stopping, and witnesses who described a sense of lost time as the world around them seemed to shift and change. In some cases, witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky. In others, they described a feeling of time passing. As my off-duty hours were consumed by this research, I started to compile a file cross-referencing cases in search of patterns. The majority of the disappearances happened at night, many of them in remote areas, and witnesses reported electronic malfunctions, radios cutting out, and phones losing signal just before the disappearances. I could feel myself changing. I became jumpy and paranoid every time I patrolled that stretch of Highway 50, half expecting to see strange lights or shadowy figures. One night over coffee at the station, Mike confronted me about the change. "Sarah, you've got to let this go," he said, his eyes full of concern. "The Chen case is cold, it's eating you up." I wanted to tell him everything about the Highway of Tears and the patterns I'd found, but I knew how it would sound. I'd be taken off active duty and sent to Psych EVB. I nodded and promised to take some time off to clear my head, but I couldn't let it go, and the following night I found myself back on Highway 50 off duty. My personal, it was just after midnight when my radio began to crackle with static. At first, I thought nothing of it because reception was spotty out here at the best of times, but then I noticed the lights on my dashboard flickering, my headlights dimming, then brightening, then dimming again. Heart. I had borrowed the car, which was loaded with cameras and scanning equipment, from a friend in the UFO watching community. I'm not sure what I expected to find, perhaps something to make sense of the senseless, to explain the inexplicable. I saw a light in the field next to the highway, not a flashlight or a car headlight, but something different that pulsed with a soft bluish glow hovering about 6 feet off the ground. I stepped out of my car, forgot my camera in my hand, and the light seemed to beckon to me, pulling me forward. I took one step, then another, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice said, "This is it." The electronic interference reported in other cases was yelling at me to stop, get back in the car, and drive away as quickly as possible. But it was overpowered by an intense sense of curiosity and longing. I had to understand what the light was. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The light remained just ahead of me, always just out of reach. I was dimly aware of my feet moving and the brush scraping against my legs, and then all of a sudden the light vanished. I blinked, confused, and the spell was broken, leaving me standing in the middle of the field, not knowing how far. I had come expecting to see my car's headlights when I turned back toward the highway, but instead I saw nothing but empty desert that was silvered by a moon I had forgotten seeing earlier. Panic struck, and I spun around in an attempt to get my bear, but instead I saw footprints in the dirt that led to where I stood, and beyond them, another set of familiar prints that I had seen once before they abruptly ended in the middle of nowhere. I stood there, my mind spinning as the first rays of dawn crept across the horizon. I realized that I was no longer the investigator and had become entangled in the mystery. I decided to follow David Chen's footprints, regardless of what had happened to him or what lay beyond that impossible ending. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever came next, and then I moved forward, leaving my own trail of footprints in the desert sand. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, there's in the morning dew, the first footprint appeared like a phantom, its shape unmistakably human but far too large to belong to any of us. I stared at it, coffee mug forgotten in my hand, as the rising sun cast long shadows across our ravaged campsite, our food scattered about, tents slashed, and there was an eerie silence. An abandoned car with its engine still running, and a set of footprints leading nowhere. The highway of tears had claimed another victim, and I had become just another unsolved mystery on America's most remote road. My name is Alex, and this camping trip was supposed to be a chance for my family to reconnect, escape the constant buzz of technology, and remember what it was like to just be together. My wife, Sarah, our 2 children, Lily and Max, and I had spent months planning this getaway to Blue Pine Campground, a remote site, but it was that one enormous footprint that sent a chill down my spine. Whatever had visited us in the night was no ordinary animal, and I had a sickening feeling it wasn't done with us yet. It felt like we had finally found a way to stop the busy pace of our lives and just breathe when we arrived late yesterday afternoon, nestled deep in the mountains. The kids were giddy with excitement as we set up our tents and gathered wood for the fire. As the sun set, we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, our laughter resonating through the trees. If only I had realized at that time how quickly our idyllic retreat would turn into a nightmare. The first indication that something was amiss came in the middle of the night when I woke up to the sound of rustling. It was much too loud to be a raccoon or any of the small wildlife we had been warned about, so I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. As I looked out, I saw a flash of movement at the edge of our campsite. Something large ducked behind a tree too quickly for me to make out its shape, and I lay awake for hours listening to the sounds of something large moving around our camp. When morning arrived, it was evident how much of an intrusion our cooler had. Sarah's voice jolted me out of my reverie as she stood in the entrance of our tent, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. I tried to keep my voice calm for her sake, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true because bears don't leave footprints like that. The tent had been upended, its contents scattered across the ground, and there in a patch of bare earth was that enormous footprint, Alex. I wanted nothing more than to say yes, pack up our belongings, and drive back to the safety of civilization, but when I tried to start the car, my blood ran cold, the engine sputtered and died, refusing to turn over no matter how many times I tried. It's okay, I told my family, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. The forest around us seemed too quiet, the shadows between the trees too deep. Dad, can we go home? Lily asked in a small, scared voice. We decided to stick together, so we packed some supplies and started down the trail towards the ranger station. It was only 5 miles, which would have been an easy hike under normal circumstances, but with every snapping twig and rustle in the underbrush, our nerves grew a little more frayed. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. You can't go out there alone. What if whatever did this is still out there? Max noticed another footprint about halfway there. This one was bigger and fresher than the first one, pressing into a patch of mud next to the trail. Sarah whispered, drawing the children nearer. I wanted to reassure her that it was probably just a coincidence, but the word stuck in my throat because I knew deep down that she was right. We picked up our pace, the children whimpering as branches scratched at their arms and legs. The sun was setting, the forest was getting darker by the minute, and the ranger station remained. AL's low, rumbling growl, which seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, suddenly caused Lily to scream and Max to start crying. I yelled, scooping Lily up, and Sarah grabbed Max's hand. We ran down the trail in blind panic, with branches whipping at our faces and roots threatening to trip us at every step. As that growl got closer, I had the opportunity to look back, but I instantly wished I hadn't because something huge and dark was moving through the trees behind us. I saw a flash of teeth and glowing eyes before I turned around and ran faster than I had ever run in my life. We exploded into a small clearing, gasping for air, and there, miraculously, was a cabin. Not the ranger station we had been aiming for, but it seemed like salvation at that moment. I didn't pause to consider our luck. Instead, we ran for the door, hoping it would be unlocked. The handle turned under my grasp, and we fell inside, slamming the door behind us for a long time. We just stood there, chests heaving, and listened to the sounds of as our eyes adapted to the gloom. We started to take in our surroundings. The cabin was small, with only one room, a fireplace, a few pieces of rustic furniture, and shelves lined with canned goods and supplies. It looked like some sort of emergency shelter or hunting lodge. Something big was circling the cabin. Scratching noises came from the walls, and a low, frustrated growl echoed through the night. What is it, Daddy? Lily whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. I don't know, sweetheart, I said, caressing her hair. As the children huddled on a threadbare couch, Sarah found some lanterns and lit them, creating a warm glow throughout the room. She pulled me aside and asked, Alex, what are we going to do? In a tremulous voice. What if it doesn't leave? I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. We've got shelter, and it looks like there's enough food here to last a while, so we'll wait it out. However, as the night wore on, that confidence started to wane, as the creature outside showed no signs of leaving. The children eventually fell into a restless sleep after Sarah and I took turns keeping watch and peering out the windows into the darkness. During my watch, which was during the darkest hours of the night, I saw it clearly for the first time. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a creature. I could hear it moving around the cabin, testing the walls and door, and occasionally it would let out a roar that made the windows rattle. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that appeared to be a patchwork of animal parts. The majority of its body was covered in thick fur, but I could see patches of scales and what appeared to be feathers. Its face was a nightmare combination of a bear and something almost human, with eyes that glowed in an unnatural yellow in the moonlight. As I watched in horror, it turned those glowing eyes directly towards me, and then it smiled impossibly, revealing rows of razor-sharpened teeth. I staggered back from the window, my heart. I don't know how long we stayed in that cabin, but the growl that rumbled through the night was very real. The only things that marked our days together were the rising and setting of the sun and the constant presence of the creature outside. We carefully rationed the food, knowing that we might have to wait a long time. The kids were surprisingly resilient, turning our confinement into a game of sorts, but I could see the strain. We waited another full day before we dared to venture out of the forest, which seemed normal again with birds singing and small animals scuttling around. But the claw marks on the cabin walls and the enormous footprints in the mud were unquestionably proof that our ordeal had been real. Sarah was wearing on the constant fear, and on what I believe was the 5th day, we woke up to silence, no growls, and no scratching at the walls. I cautiously looked out the window and saw that the clearing was empty. As we drove home, the kids talking excitedly about their adventure, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to see. A creature that lurked in the shadows of the world, defying explanation. We never went camping again, but we did find park rangers and a search party, and our car had been fixed. Apparently, someone had noticed it sitting abandoned and called it in. We told them a sanitized version of events, that we'd gotten lost, found the cabin, and waited out a storm. The first thing I noticed was the silence on a cruise ship with over 3,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members. Sometimes on dark nights, when the wind howls outside our securely locked doors, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the woods and wondering if somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that creature is still roaming, waiting for the next unwary family to cross its path. The wilderness holds ancient and terrifying secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth and claws. My name is Mia Chun, and what should have been a leisurely Caribbean cruise turned into the most confusing experience ever. I was standing in the center of the Leo deck, where just hours before families had been splashing in the pool and music had been blasting from the speakers. Now, all I could hear was the soft lap of waves against the hull and the distant hum of engines as I turned slowly in a circle, taking in the empty lounge chairs and half-empty cocktails. I'm still not sure I believe what happened to me, but I do know that time isn't always as linear as we think it is, and sometimes the fabric of reality can slip in ways we can't even comprehend. It had begun as a normal day at sea. I had woken up late, eaten a greasy breakfast, and then spent the morning relaxing by the pool with my most recent beach red. At noon, I made the decision to return to my cabin for a brief nap before my memories of the afternoon activities include closing my eyes and listening to the ship's gentle rocking as it lulled me to sleep. When I woke up, the light coming through my porthole window seemed strangely dimmer and had a bluish quality that I had never seen before. I was confused and checked my phone, but the screen was completely dead and black. I lay down and frowned. I got up and tried the cabin's phone, but there was only a faint buzzing on the line. That's when I noticed the silence. No distant laughter from the hallway. No muffled a knot of uneasiness formed in my stomach as I stepped out into the hallway, which was empty of the usual bustle of passengers and crew members. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loudly on the carpeted floor as I made my way to the elevator bank hello. I called out, sounding small and lost in the empty corridor, but there was no response. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed wildly out of place in the eerie silence. I tried to justify this as I rode up to the Leo deck. The full extent of the strangeness hit me when the elevator doors opened onto the Lido deck. The enormous open-air deck was completely empty, with lounge chairs sitting empty, some with towels and books still draped over them as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. The bars were unmanned rows of colorful cocktails abandoned on their counters. Perhaps there was some sort of emergency drill that I had slept through, but no, they always announced those well in advance, and surely someone would have woken me. As I made my circuit of the deck, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The lifeboats were all still in place. If there had been an emergency evacuation, they would have undoubtedly been launched. I spent the next few hours searching the ship deck by deck, my panic increasing with each empty room and abandoned corridor. I called again, louder this time. Is anyone here? Only the sound of the waves answered. There were signs of life everywhere I looked, including the casino slot machines blinking silently in the dim light, the main dining room table set for a dinner that would never be served, half-eaten meals in the buffet, a load of laundry tumbling endlessly in a dryer in the otherwise empty laundromat, and a child's stuffed animal dropped in the middle of a hallway. However, even though there should have been thousands of people on board, I found no trace as night fell, or what I assumed to be night given the deepening of that odd bluish light. I sank into the captain's chair, exhausted and terrified, wondering what had happened, where everyone was, and more importantly, what was going on. The bridge was as empty as the rest of the ship, but at least here were signs of life. Radar screens blinked, indicating our position in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. Navigation systems hummed softly, and the ship was still on course, its automated systems continuing their work even without human oversight. As I sat there looking blankly at the array of instruments in front of me, something caught my attention. The date display on one of the monitors said August 13th, 2024 in glowing green letters. I blinked, thinking I might be seeing things, but no, it was a week later. Impossibly, a week had gone by since I had fallen asleep, and I laughed, but then a high, hysterical sound reverberated strangely in the empty bridge. This couldn't be happening. People didn't simply lose a week of time, and entire ships full of people didn't just disappear. The following few days, if they were days at all, seemed to have passed in a blur as time seemed to have lost all meaning. I wandered the ship, leaving notes in every public area, pleading for a response or some indication that I wasn't alone. I tried every phone, radio, and possible way to communicate, but all I got was static. I ate from the slowly rotting supplies in the ship's enormous kitchens, slept fitfully in a different cabin every night, and spoke aloud to keep myself sane by recounting my actions as if I were the main character in a strange reality show. Saw lights on what I believe was the fourth day of my solitude. At first, I thought I was having hallucinations, but as the lights approached, I realized with a start that they were far-off pinpricks of light on the horizon, growing larger by the minute, and that hope was rushing through me again, another ship, a rescue party. I rushed to the bow, waving my arms and shouting, even though I knew they were still too far away to see or hear me. When I saw a beam of light shoot down from the center of the formation, touching the deck just a few feet away from me, I was elated, confused, and then kind of numbly accepted that there should be strange lights in the sky after everything else. The lights were beautiful, pulsing with colors, and I had no idea what they were doing, casting shimmering reflections on the calm sea. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, the lights disappeared, and I was no longer alone. The deck was crowded with people, including passengers wearing swimwear and sundresses, crew members in their clean uniforms, and others. Voices rose in a flurry of questions and exclamations as everyone milled about in confusion. What had happened? Where had everyone gone? Was I dreaming? I stood frozen, unable to understand what I was seeing. A man in a captain's uniform strode purposefully towards me, his face wearing a mask of concern. "Miss, are you okay? You look pale." I opened my mouth but was unable to speak. Happened in the days that followed as the ship returned to port. Everyone else on board told a story about it. It seemed like no time had passed at all. One minute they were going about their day, and the next they were standing on the deck, confused and disoriented. I was the only one who remembered the empty ship, the days of loneliness, and the strange lights that only I had experienced during that impossible week. The incident made headlines all over the world, and the cruise ship reappears after experts are consulted about its mysterious disappearance. As for me, I gave my statement to the authorities and then withdrew from the public eye. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I describe the profound loneliness of those days on the empty ship, the bone-deep wrongness of a world slightly out of sync? I've never set foot on another cruise ship, and the sight of the ocean fills me with an unnamed dread and fear. Theories were put forth and disproved. Some spoke of wormholes, others of alien abduction, and some fringe voices even suggested a mass hallucination or an elaborate hoax. I don't know what happened on the paradise of the seas, where everyone went, why I was abandoned, or what those lights in the sky were, but I do know that our understanding of time and space is far more limited than we realize. There are forces at work that we can't even begin to understand, and occasionally, if we're extremely unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'm back there alone on an empty ship, adrift in a sea of time. The next time you're on a cruise ship, or any ship for that matter, and you feel a sudden chill, notice a slight change in the quality of the light, or find yourself alone in a place that should be crowded. Remember my story and hope with all your heart that you don't fall through the cracks of time like I did, because, believe me, once you've experienced that kind of impossible solitude, you're never quite the same. I got that glimpse into the vast, terrifying unknown that lies beyond. Similar to the first night, the scratching began with a faint, persistent sound that might have been tree branches against the cabin's wooden walls if it weren't for the complete stillness of the air outside. I lay awake with Emily breathing steadily next to me, listening as the noise became louder and more intentional. It wasn't until I heard a distinct tapping on the bedroom window that I realized with a chill that went straight to my bones that whatever was out there wasn't a tree, and that it wanted Daniel and what was supposed to, if only we had known what was waiting for us in those woods. Our romantic getaway with my girlfriend would not have turned into a waking nightmare that I'm still trying to comprehend. We had been dating for a year, and a week in a remote cabin seemed like the ideal escape, with no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the two of us and the great outdoors. We arrived at the cabin late Friday afternoon, and it was exactly as advertised, a comfortable two-bedroom log structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The closest neighbor was miles away, and the cabin's owner, a gruff older man named Bill, gave us the keys and gave us a quick tour. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes darted nervously around, never quite settling on one spot. Now, when we stood on the porch, he said, "Don't go wandering in the woods after dark, lots. The dirt road leading to the property had been rough enough to make us question our decision more than once, but as soon as we got out of the car, the fresh mountain air and the complete silence erased our doubts. There is a lot of wildlife out there, and it's easy to get confused. If you hear any strange noises at night, just ignore them. They're probably just raccoons or something. I nodded, not giving it much thought at the time. Oh, and Bill added his hand on the door. Whatever you do, don't open the doors or windows at night. No matter what you hear, get it. Before we could ask him what he meant, he left, his truck kicking up dust as he sped down the dirt road. Emily and I exchanged glances, and she said that was weird. The remainder of the day was perfect. We hiked a nearby trail, cooked dinner on the old wood stove, and spent the evening snuggling up on the porch swing while watching the stars come out in a sky free of light pollution. It wasn't until we were getting ready for bed that I noticed the scratches, long, deep gouges in the wood on the inside of the doors and around the windows that appeared to have been made by something with we went to bed making jokes about ghost bears to lighten the mood, but as the night went on and the scratching began, those jokes stopped being funny. I lay there with every muscle tense, listening to the sound move around the cabin. Sharp Claws, come look at this. I called out to her, and she frowned as she ran her fingers over the marks. It's strange, like a bear tried to get in or something. Maybe I said something about it. Scratch, pause, followed by the tapping on the window as if something were testing the glass. Emily stirred next to me. Dan, do you hear that? I nodded, not believing my voice, and we clung to each other, barely breathing, as the tapping continued from window to window until, after what seemed like hours, it stopped. The following morning, we tried to make sense of what had happened, and as dawn started to break, we spent the day hiking and swimming in a nearby lake. Sunshine made the night's terrors seem absurd and far away, but as evening approached and we made our way back to the cabin, the uneasiness returned. We checked all the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to divert our attention with board games and wine. The scratching had begun earlier that evening, but this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural sound that was almost but not quite a voice. Emily whispered that her face was pale in the lamplight, and I wanted to reassure her that it wasn't an animal. We huddled together on the bed, watching the shadows beneath the door, listening to whatever was out there circle the cabin repeatedly. At one point, something heavy threw itself against the front door, making the entire cabin shudder. I considered running for the car, but the keys were in the living room and the thought of opening any door was out of the question. We could have argued that it was just the wind or our imaginations playing tricks on us, but as the not-quite voice grew louder and formed sounds that were almost words, I couldn't lie to her or to ourselves. Seemed impossible, so we waited and held on to each other as the night dragged on forever. Just before dawn, at the darkest hour, when hope seemed to be the furthest away, we heard footsteps on the porch and then a knock at the door. It was a human knock. Hello, anyone in there? The man's voice was gruff but fortunately normal, and as we cautiously approached the door through the peephole, I saw Bill, the cabin owner, standing on the porch with a flashlight. When he was satisfied, he turned to us with a grim expression and said, I owe you an apology. He said, I should have told you the whole truth when you got here, but I was afraid you'd leave and I need the money if I'm being honest. He cut me off and pushed past us into the cabin. I know that's why I'm here, you too, okay? He said, looking much older. This land is not right, it never has been. Since I can remember, there have been things in these woods that aren't natural. Usually they keep to themselves, but occasionally, especially when there's new blood around, they become curious. I felt a shiver go down my spine. What kinds of things? He shook his head. I haven't seen him closely, but I've heard him feel them watching. They're smart, whatever they are, and they're hungry. Why don't you leave? Emily asked. Bill replied simply that this land has been in my family for generations. In addition, he added, dropping his voice to a near as the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, Bill stood up and said, "They'll be gone now. They can't stand the daylight. You two should pack up and go. I'll refund your money." We didn't argue. Within an hour of us spending the rest of that night huddled in the living room with Bill listening to his stories of the things that lived in the woods, tales passed down through his family of people who'd vanished over the years of nights when the barriers between our world and something else seem to thin on dark nights when the wind is blowing just right. I find myself listening for that scratching sound, and in my dreams, I still hear that almost voice calling from just beyond the walls, trying to form words I hope I never understand. We were driving down the mountain road, the cabin receding in our rearview mirror, and we never talked much about what happened that weekend. How could we explain it to anyone else, even to ourselves? If you ever find yourself in a remote cabin miles from civilization and you hear a scratching at the door or a tapping at the window, remember my story. Keep the doors locked and the curtains drawn, and do not allow it to enter, because once you acknowledge those things, you will know that there are places in this world where the veil between realities is thin and things we cannot understand are just out of sight. I don't know what lives in those woods, why it was so interested in us, or what it might have done if it came inside. The voice crackled through the CB radio, desperate and full of static. "Please, anyone, I need help. I'm at the old Starlight truck. Stop something here. Things in the dark will never stop calling once you let them know you can hear them. Eventually, curiosity, fear, or just plain tiredness may lead you to answer. Trust me, some calls are better left unanswered, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some woods are best left unexplored, no matter how inviting they may seem in the daylight." The rational part of my brain told me to ignore it and keep driving, but after 20 years of driving, I realized that sometimes, in the vast emptiness of the American night, a trucker is all that stands between a stranger and disaster. With a muttered curse, I flipped on my turn signal and took the next exit. I didn't realize it at the time, but that choice would I'm Mike Callahan, and I've been hauling freight across the country since I was old enough to obtain my CDL. I've seen my fair share of strange things on the desolate highways, including ghost lights, mysterious weather patterns, and what some might call UFOs. However, nothing in all my years prepared me for what I encountered that night at the abandoned Starlight truck stop. It was a routine run from Seattle to Miami with a trailer full of electronics, and I was enjoying the miles melting. It was just after 2 a.m. and the radio kept me company as I drove into the New Mexico desert. It played a mix of old country songs and the occasional conversation from other truckers. I initially assumed that the distress call was just some children playing on the channel, but something in that voice, the unadulterated fear and desperation, made me reconsider. I tried to reply to get more details, but all I got was that unsettling static, and I knew the Starlight had been a popular stop in the past. This little oasis of neon and greasy food in the middle of nowhere had closed years ago, becoming just another victim of the new highway bypass. Now it was just a crumbling relic slowly being reclaimed by the desert. As I took the exit, I had a chilly feeling in my stomach, wondering if this was a trap. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to trick a trucker off the main road by pretending to be in distress, but I couldn't get the vision of that frightened voice. If someone was truly in trouble out here, they didn't have the Starlight truck stop was in worse shape than I remembered. The once happy neon sign was dark, most of its tubes were broken, the windows of the main building were boarded up, and half the roof had collapsed in the large parking lot that was once filled with opportunities for assistance. The old access road was hardly more than a pair of tire tracks, and now there were weeds growing up through cracks in the asphalt. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating scrub brush and the occasional piece of wind-blown trash, and then rising out of the night like a ghost. I heard a distress call on the CB, but there was no echo, so I took my flashlight from the cab and carefully approached the building's boards over the main doors. The rigs from all over the country were empty except for tumbleweeds and broken glass. I pulled up in front of the main entrance, leaving my engine running. The only sounds in the eerie silence were the idle of my truck and the creak of settling metal as the old building shifted in the night wind. "Hello," I called out, sounding small and lost in the emptiness. Had been pried away, leaving a dark maw that seemed to swallow my light. My instinct told me to get back in my truck and leave, but I couldn't get rid of the memory of that frantic voice. What if someone was inside and couldn't call out? I stepped inside the flashlight's beam and saw a scene of abandonment and decay with overturned tables, broken plates, and layers of dust covering everything. It appeared as though scavengers had picked the place clean years prior. "Hello," I called again, my voice echoing in the empty space, and anyone as I turned the corner into what used to be the kitchen, I heard a scraping sound coming from the back of the building. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Hey, you're okay back there?" I moved toward the sound, my heart pounding, and my flashlight beam struck something that made my blood run cold. It was a CB radio propped up against an old stove. It looked brand new and completely out of place in the ruins surrounding it. I approached slowly, my mind racing. Had the person who called for help left this here? But why and where? I took a step back, suddenly aware of how quiet it was, even though the wind seemed to have died down, and then I heard a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere behind me. It was almost but not quite a voice, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around. In the moment before terror took over, I noticed something else on the floor around the radio, strange markings, curved lines, and symbols drawn in what looked horribly like dried blood. I would like to say that I fought, or at least had the mental capacity to flee, but the truth is that I froze, rooted to the spot as that thing unfolded itself, growing even taller as it flowed into the room like smoke given form. Its limbs were bent at impossible angles, its face was a blank expanse of pale skin with a mouth that split it from top to bottom, and it was vaguely humanoid but too tall and thin. It reached for me with hands that resembled claws, and I felt my consciousness ebbing away. When I woke up in my truck parked on the side of the highway, I thought it had all been a vivid nightmare until I noticed the dust on my clothes, the scratches on my arms, and the CB radio from the abandoned truck stop on the passenger seat. My logbook revealed that I had lost nearly 6 hours. 6 hours that I couldn't remember. I drove to the closest town in a day, checked into a motel, and tried to make sense of what had happened, had occurred. Had I actually seen what I believed I had seen, or had my mind created some unthinkable horror to fill in the blanks in my memory? I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That I had been lured to an abandoned truck stop by a ghost on the CB and then attacked by a monster? They would laugh me out of the station if they didn't lock me up for my own safety. In the end, I did the only thing I could do, got back on the road, and completed my run. But after that night, I found myself jumping at shadows. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of that CB radio, but I couldn't bear to have it in my truck either. It sits in a storage unit now, wrapped in chains and locked in a box. And some nights I swear I can hear it calling in that same desperate voice, begging for help. I've tried to learn more about the Starlight truck stop since then, and it turns out it has a history of disappearances. I started taking routes that avoided long stretches of empty highway, even if it meant longer trips. There are things out there in the dark that we cannot explain that lurk on the edges of our world, waiting for someone to answer their call. So if you're ever out on the road late at night and you hear a desperate voice on the CB begging for help, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know if what I experienced was real or some sort of hallucination or something in between. Back decades, truckers stopped there and were never seen again. Local legends about ancient burial grounds and doorways to other worlds. If you find yourself driving past an abandoned truck stop in the middle of the New Mexico desert, keep going, don't look back, and don't stop, because you never know what might be waiting there in the darkness, ready to pull you into a nightmare you might never wake up from. As for me, I still drive, but never at night if I can avoid it, and I keep my CB. Sometimes the call for help isn't coming from someone in trouble. Sometimes it's coming from the trouble itself. Turned off no matter how desolate the road becomes, because I've come to realize that some calls are better left unanswered and some mysteries are best left unsolved. When I first stepped out onto the porch that morning, I noticed that there was an eerie, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, I noticed a vast, intricate pattern carved into my wheat field, with the stalks bent and woven with impossible precision. There was no distant bird song, no distant cattle, and no wind rustling through the cornfields. My name is Jack Harper, and I have been farming this land for more than 30 years. It has been in my family for generations, passed down from father to son since my great-grandfather's father first broke ground here in the 1890s. I've seen droughts, floods, and everything in between, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. I knew my life would never be the same as the rising sun cast long shadows across the design, but I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went or how dangerous the truth would turn out to be. About a week before the crop circle appeared, I was up late reviewing some paperwork in the kitchen when I noticed the lights. After that, my tractor started acting up, the electronics going haywire for no apparent reason again, which was annoying but nothing too unusual for aging farm equipment. A few of my cows were spooked one night, breaking through a fence and stampeding across the north pasture, which was unusual but not unheard of. We're pretty remote out here. The closest neighbor is 5 miles down the road. At first, I thought it was headlights from a passing car, but when I stepped outside, I noticed 3 bright orbs of light hovering silently over my wheat field. They pulsed with an unearthly glow, casting long shadows across the swaying stalks. I stood there frozen for what seemed like hours but was probably just a few minutes. And then, as abruptly as they appeared, the lights shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. I told myself that I was exhausted. Perhaps I dozed off at the kitchen table and dreamed the entire thing. But deep down I knew what I had seen was real. I watched for the next few nights, but the lights didn't come back. And just when I thought I had imagined it all, I woke up to discover the crop circle. It was enormous, enclosing almost half of my 100-acre wheat field. The design was extremely intricate, with a series of interlocking circles and crescents that appeared to spiral out from a central point, and the wheat stalks were bent rather than broken. Bob has been a friend for years, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes as he surveyed the damage. We could be pranksters, he suggested, not sounding very convinced. You know how kids get in the summer looking for thrills. I shook my head. Bob, this would have taken a team of people all night to complete, and they would have left tracks. Look at the ground. There isn't a single footprint or tire track anywhere. He didn't have an explanation for that. As is common in small towns, it spread quickly, and by noon, my driveway was jam-packed with local news crews, amateur paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers. I tried my best to keep them off my property, but it was like fighting back the tide, and that's when things started to get really weird. It started with the animals. My dogs, who are normally friendly, started acting aggressively, snarling at anyone who approached the crop circle. and the cattle refused to graze anywhere near that field, congregating at the far end of their pasture, bellowing uneasily through the night. And then the equipment failures got worse. Not only did my tractor die, but all of the farm's electronic equipment, including cell phones, died within minutes of being fully charged. The TV only showed static, and every night I found myself wandering through that wheat field, with the stalks whispering and singing around me in voices that were barely understandable. Something was always just a week or so after the crop circle appeared. I had a visitor who introduced himself as Dr. Alan Fredman, an astrophysicist from the State University. He was different from the other investigators who had come sniffing around, quieter and more serious, Mr. Harper, and he said his eyes never left the crop circle. I would wake up in a cold sweat, with the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling that I was about to understand something vast and terrible. The lights in the sky, possibly electronic disturbances, caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up. He turned to face me, and his expression became solemn because, Mr. Harper, this isn't the first time this has happened. There is a pattern. Over the course of the next few hours, Dr. Fredman told me things that completely shocked me, including the fact that other crop circles have appeared across the nation in recent years, all following a similar design, and that there have been more UFO sightings in those areas, gone missing every time in the weeks after a circle appeared. We think he said in a low voice that these are test sites, that whatever intelligence is behind this is getting ready for something bigger. I wanted to write it off as crazy talk, but after what I'd seen and experienced, I couldn't help but ask, what do they want? Dr. Fredman shook his head. We don't know, but we think you might be in danger, Mr. Harper. What do they want? I was on the verge of understanding what to do when he said, let's set up some monitoring equipment. He added, whatever you do, don't enter that field no matter what you hear or what you think you see. I made a promise to him, but I soon realized that promises are difficult to keep when reality itself seems to be falling apart. We've documented cases of unusual behavior of people claiming to receive messages or orders from an unknown source. Dr. Friedman and his team set up cameras and sensors around the crop circle's perimeter, took samples of the soil and wheat, and spoke to each other in low, worried tones. The next few days were a flurry of activity. I would wake up with strange symbols etched in my mind, my fingers itching to draw them, and the urge to walk into that field to reach the circle's center became nearly overwhelming. It all culminated on the 7th night after the circle. A low, pulsing vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere suddenly woke me up. I stumbled to the window and felt my heart stop. The crop circle was glowing, pulsing with a soft blue-white light that seemed to beat in time with the thrumming sound. And above it were lights I had seen before, but this time they were descending. I don't remember choosing to go outside. One minute I was at the window, and the next I was running across the yard in my pajamas in the direction of the circle by. I was at the edge of the wheat field when a hand grabbed my arm and pulled me back. It was Dr. Fredman, his face pale in the otherworldly light. Harper, no, he shouted over the thrumming. If you go in there, we'll lose you. I struggled against his grip, the whispers in my head drowning out everything else. But he held firm, and slowly but painfully I felt the force I couldn't resist. Dr. Fredman's warning echoed in my head, but it seemed distant and unimportant. All that mattered was reaching the center of the circle and meeting whatever was coming down from the sky. In the days that followed, government agents swarmed my farm, dug up the crop circle, tested and retested every grain of soil, and interrogated me and Dr. Fredman and his team for hours. They found nothing, no radiation, no unexplained elements, nothing to prove anything. We watched in awe as the lights descended into the center of the crop circle. There was a flash so bright it left spots dancing in my vision, and then nothing. The lights were gone, the thrumming stopped, and the crop circle lay dark and still. Even though there was no evidence to support the official story, which claimed that it was an elaborate hoax, I know what I saw and what I felt. 5 years have passed since that night, and although I still farm the land, things have changed. No matter what we plant, the wheat no longer grows in that field, and on calm nights, I occasionally feel as though I can still hear those whispers on the edge of my mind, and occasionally when I look up at the stars, I can't get rid of the feeling that something is we are not alone, and the universe is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. So if you ever find a strange pattern carved into your fields or see lights in the sky that move like nothing you've ever seen before, remember my story. Whatever you do, don't answer when they call, because once you do, there's no going back. The coffee cup was still warm. I'm looking back, watching, and waiting, and I'm not sure what would have happened if I had made it to the center of that circle. Something had been here moments ago, but the rest stop was empty as I stood there with the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye there at the edge of the woods, a figure watching, and in that moment I knew I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have seen, something I might not escape from. It wasn't the eerie silence, the abandoned cars, or even the fresh tire tracks leading nowhere, but that paper cup in the trash, steam still rising from its contents, that made my skin crawl. Nothing at all prepared me for what I saw that night at the Pinewood rest stop. It was a routine run from St. Louis to Portland with a trailer full of electronics I'd been pushing hard trying to figure out. My name is Alex, and I've been driving cross-country for the better part of 10 years. Long-haul trucking isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills and satisfies my wanderlust. I've seen my share of strange things on the road, including inexplicable lights in the sky, ghost towns that aren't on any map, and what some might call supernatural occurrences. I had been fighting sleep for the past hour, my eyes gritty and my mind fuzzy, so I was trying to make up time after a delay at my last stop. The night was moonless. The highway was a ribbon of black stretching endlessly before me, and when I saw the sign for the rest stop, I nearly cried with relief. I told myself that I would only need to take a quick break, splash some water on my face, and grab a coffee, and I'd be fine for a few more hours. The rest stop emerged from the darkness like an island of light, one of those older ones, with a small building housing restrooms, vending machines, and a separate area for trucks to park. When I pulled in, I saw a few cars in the lot, but no one was there. I parked and got out of my rig, stretching my sore muscles from sitting for hours. The air was strangely still, with no breeze, no sounds of insects, and no distant traffic, all of which should have been my first warning. I walked to the building, my footsteps loudly echoing on the concrete, the door creaking as I pushed it open, the sound startling in the silence. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly. Casting a harsh glare over the empty, I splashed cold water on my face and let it run down my neck as I looked up at my gray and haggard reflection in the mirror. Something in the mirror made my heart skip a beat, and I saw it reflected in the partially open door behind me. I whirled around, but the doorway was empty. I called out, sounding thin and nervous even to my own ears, but I got no response. So I shook it off as a trick of my exhausted mind and left the eye, went to the restroom, and made my way to the vending machines when I noticed the other oddities. A jacket draped over a chair as though its owner had just left, a smartphone on a table with its screen still lit up, and a steaming cup of coffee in the trash can by the door. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I went back outside and scanned the parking lot, saw that the cars I had seen earlier were still there, some with their doors hanging open, and went up to the closest one, a blue sedan with keys in the ignition. Engine ticking as it cooled hay. I yelled, my voice echoing across the empty lot. Anyone here? The silence that answered was so deafening that I noticed new tire tracks coming from one of the parking spots and stopping suddenly at the edge of the lot, as if the car had just disappeared into thin air. My heart was racing, and with adrenaline clearing the fog of exhaustion from my mind, I turned with the intention of running back to my truck and getting the hell out of here, but instead I saw the figure at the it was human-shaped, but somehow too tall and too thin, and its proportions were off. It stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree, and watched me. For a long time, neither of us moved, and then slowly, it raised a hand beckoning, and I felt a shock of terror. I ran back to my truck with a speed I didn't know I had, fumbling with the keys and swearing as I dropped them and scrabbling in the gravel to get them back as I pulled. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over an impossible frame. Its face was smooth and featureless except for deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a cat's, and its mouth split its face from ear to ear with needle-sharp teeth. I put the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I climbed into the cab and took a chance to look back. The figure was closer now, no longer hiding behind the trees in the harsh glare of the rest stop lights. I slammed the truck into gear and noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Dozens of figures with the same impossible physiology were coming out of the woods, and they were all moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. I floored it, and the truck's tires spun in the gravel before gaining traction. I then ripped out of that rest stop as if the demons of hell were pursuing me, and I didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky. It was 2 states away, and even then, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. When I eventually plucked up the courage to check my mirrors, the highway behind me was deserted, with no sign of a chase or the horror I had left behind. But the memory of those figures and that beckoning hand was ingrained in my mind. I thought about reporting what I had seen, but who would believe me? I would sound like a crazy person talking about monsters at a rest stop. So I kept quiet, completed my run, and tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But I kept thinking about those people at the rest stop, those who had abandoned their cars and possessions, and those who had followed that beckoning hand into the woods. And where had they gone? What had happened to them in the weeks that followed? I dug a little, but it wasn't easy because I'm not a detective and I had very little to go on. But what I discovered chilled me to my core. There were whispered tales among late-night travelers and long-haul truckers about rest stops where people disappeared without a trace. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I know that they're out there waiting at the edges of lonely highways in the shadow of late-night rest stops. I still drive, but never at night if I can avoid it. I push myself to make it from one major town to the next without breaks. And I never ever stop if I see a figure at the edge of the woods beckoning at night. Some have called them aliens, while others have said they are interdimensional beings. Sometimes when it's dark and the road seems to go on forever, I see a lone figure standing at the edge of the woods. I believe I see them in my mirrors, tall, thin figures who keep pace with my truck despite its speed while it waits. Sometimes I wonder if I actually escaped that night or if I'm still there, trapped in some in-between place, living out a life that's not quite real. For that reason, if you're ever driving late at night and you see a rest stop emerge out of the darkness, think twice before you remember my story and keep driving no matter how exhausted you are, because some rest stops aren't meant for rest. Some are gateways to places we weren't meant to go, and once you cross that threshold, there's no turning back. This first photo only showed trees. Stop, check your gas gauge, your caffeine levels, and your fatigue, and ask yourself if it's worth the risk, because you never know what might be waiting there in the shadows, who or what might be beckoning you into the woods. I lowered the viewfinder with trembling hands, my eyes darting to the deepening shadows around my campsite as night fell, and I realized I was no longer alone in these woods. The second shot caught a blur of movement at the edge of the frame, but the third image was what really chilled me. It showed a humanoid figure emerging from the shadows between two ancient pines, but it was somehow too tall and thin, its proportions warped in a way that defied natural law, and it was staring directly at the camera at me. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a 2E solo expedition to capture the raw beauty of the old-growth forest for a conservation magazine. Maggie Chin and I have been nature photographers for more than 10 years. I've trekked through rainforests, scaled mountains, and waded through swamps to get the perfect shot. But nothing in all my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. I'd made dozens of trips like this before, and I was looking forward to the forest was a photographer's dream, with towering evergreens draped in moss, hidden waterfalls, and dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I set up my base camp in a small clearing near a babbling stream, going out every day to explore and take pictures. However, on the fourth night, things began to get strange. I was looking through my camera's day shots when I noticed something strange in the background of one image, a shape. I initially thought it was a trick of the light or possibly a deer, but something about it kept nagging at me. The following day, I went back to the same location, determined to discover what I had captured. I set up my camera trap, a motion-activated camera made to capture wildlife, and left it there for the day while I explored other areas. When I went back that evening and checked the camera, my heart almost stopped because there were dozens of images taken quickly, the first few of which showed nothing. Only the forest floor and a squirrel or two were unusual, but then the figure appeared tall and incredibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend at strange angles. Its skin, where it was visible, was pale and nearly translucent, stretched taut over an inhuman frame, and its face, God, was smooth and featureless except for two large, dark eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a cat. I stared at the pictures, refusing to believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax or a trick. Some other hiker with too much free time and a knack for Photoshop, but as I scrolled through the series of pictures, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The figure was getting closer to the camera with each picture, and in the finished picture, it was reaching towards the lens with long, motion-blurred fingers. I packed up my equipment with trembling hands, and practical Al ran back to my campsite that night, barely sleeping, hearing every twig snap and leaf rustle. I told myself that I was being silly, but I knew deep down what I had witnessed was real. When I woke up the following morning, my campsite was in ruins, my backpack had been emptied, its contents scattered all over the place, my food cache, which was hung high in a tree to keep bears away, had been torn down. The rope had snapped like thread, and there, pressed into a patch of soft earth close to my tent, was a long, narrow footprint with toes that resembled claws. My camera was resting beside it with shaky fingers. I turned it on and looked at them. Most recent pictures, and my heart almost stopped. There were new pictures taken while photos of me sleeping inside my tent were visible through the mesh window, and in each one, a figure was getting closer and closer. I should have packed up and hiked out, assignment be damned, but curiosity, stubbornness, and plain old stupidity kept me there. I told myself that if I could just get clearer photos and figure out what this thing was, then everything would make sense, so I stayed, setting up more camera traps around my campsite each night as the creature got closer. During the day, I would venture out and follow trails of broken branches and those strange footprints. I found places where the undergrowth had been crushed as if something large had beat it down, and once I found a tee of hair caught on a branch that was coarse and gray like no animal fur I'd ever seen. As the days went by, I started to feel as though I was losing my mind. I barely slept, spending my nights huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my hunting knife and jumping at every sound. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched, and the trees towered over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. It all came to a head on what should have been my last night in the forest. I had planned to hike out in the morning, my assignment finished, and my sanity hanging by a thread. I had set up my cameras for one last night of observation, hoping against hope that I must have fallen asleep in spite of my fear, because I woke up in the middle of the night and something had changed the constant sounds of the forest. Like the rustle of leaves and the chirp of insects, and I could hear something outside my tent moving softly but definitely circling and sniffing. I lay there in terror as it finished its circuit, and then, to my horror, I saw my tent's zipper start to move slowly, inch by agonizing inch, widening the opening of my tent. Wanted to scream and run to do anything, but my body wouldn't react, so I could only watch in the dark as a long, pale hand with too many joints slipped through the opening. The hand hesitated as if sensing my fear, then purposefully reached for my camera, which was next to my sleeping bag. At that moment, my survival instinct finally overcame my paralysis, and I lunged for the camera, snatching it away from that awful hand. In the same motion, I kicked out at the tent wall, tearing through the fabric and tumbling out into the night. I don't know how long I ran or how far my lungs burned, but terror kept me going until, mercifully, I saw lights ahead of the ranger station at the trailhead, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. I clutched the camera desperately and blindly as I crashed through underbrush and stumbled over roots branches that were whipping at my face behind me. I could hear it pursuing, not running, but moving with a terrible swiftness flowing through the forest like smoke. I burst out of the tree line, gasping and sobbing, and the startled ranger on duty took. I remember telling the ranger my story, and his skepticism turning to concern when he saw the raw fear in my eyes. I remember the police coming and taking my statement, and I remember the moment they asked to see my camera with trembling hands. I turned it on and started to scroll through the pictures, but where there should have been dozens of pictures of that otherworldly being, there were only trees and shadows. The rest of that night is a blur. The harsh fluorescent light of the ranger station, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, eclipsed the normal forest scenes, including the photos I was certain I had taken of the hand reaching into my tent on that last night. The entire experience started to seem like a bad dream, as if I had imagined it all. 2 weeks of being alone in the deep woods had driven me to some sort of breakdown, but then I noticed it in the very last picture on the camera. A tall, thin figure was barely visible in the background, half hidden behind a tree. I've never been back to those woods, and I've never told anyone the whole story except you. The pictures I sent in were carefully chosen to highlight the forest's natural beauty, but occasionally on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself wondering about what's out there in the deep woods, about the things that lurk just beyond T. Reach of our cameras and our sense. Some things in this world are not meant to be captured on film. If you're ever in the wilderness setting up your camera for that perfect shot of touch nature, pay attention to the shadows between the trees. If you see something moving there that doesn't quite fit, don't try to photograph it. Instead, run and don't look back. I wonder with a chill that goes deep into my bones if it's still out there watching, waiting for the next unwary photographer to venture into its domain. When I first saw her, I thought I was looking in a mirror because she had shoulder-length brown hair, green eyes, and the same tiny scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. However, this was not a reflection. Rather, it was a living, breathing woman who could have been my twin. As she waved and smiled, I felt a chill go down my spine because I knew with sickening certainty that my peaceful Caribbean CRWS had just taken a turn for the worse. Turn into uncharted waters. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and up until that point, I had been enjoying a much-needed vacation on the Majestic Dream, a luxury cruise liner exploring the Caribbean's turquoise waters. I'm a 32-year-old Seattle software engineer, and this was my first real vacation in years. I had been looking forward to 10 days of sun relaxation and, if I was lucky, a little romance. The first few days had been everything I had hoped for, with me lounging by the pool and indulging Ed in far too many fruity. I even flirted with a handsome guy named Mike who was traveling with a group of friends. However, everything changed on the fourth night at the captain's dinner. I dressed up for the event in a brand new blue dress that I had purchased especially for the cruise. As I entered the grand dining room, I noticed myself in one of the large decorative mirrors and stopped to straighten my hair. At first, I thought it was just my reflection from a different perspective, but this couldn't be real. It must be some sort of elaborate prank or a very vivid hallucination. A waiter bumped into me, breaking the spell, and by the time I looked back, she was gone, lost in the sea of passengers making their way. I was shocked to realize that she was a separate person who looked exactly like me down to the smallest detail. For a moment, the busy dining room seemed to fade away as she smiled and waved as if we were old friends. Throughout dinner, I was unable to concentrate on the conversation at my table because my eyes were constantly searching the room for my doppelganger. I once saw her sitting at a table across the room, but when I blinked, she was gone again. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mike's voice brought me back to the present. I forced a laugh. "Sorry, I was just a little tired. I suppose it was all the sun," but as the evening wore on, I couldn't get rid of the uneasiness that had descended upon me. Who was she, and why did she look exactly like me the next day? When I was heading back to my cabin to get ready for dinner, I caught a glimpse of her turning a corner at the end of the hallway. I broke into a run, but when I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty that night, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face smiling at me across the room. I spent hours searching the ship in the morning, checking every restaurant lounge and deck, but I couldn't find her. The dining room at about 2 in the morning. I decided to give up sleep and go for a walk to get my mind straight. The ship was eerily quiet as I moved through the empty hallways, and I found myself leaning against the railing on one of the upper decks, staring out at the moonlit ocean when I heard soft but distinct footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting to see my double, but Mike was looking surprised to see me. "Sarah, what are you doing up so late?" I hesitated, then decided to take a chance, Mike, because this is going to sound crazy. "Nevertheless, have you seen anyone on the ship who looks exactly like me?" He frowned and looked perplexed. "What do you mean?" I told him everything about seeing my doppelganger at dinner and about pursuing her through the ship. As I spoke, I could see the worry growing in his eyes. "Sarah," he said gently, "I think maybe you should talk to the ship's doctor." I'm not crazy, I just snapped, but I felt bad about the hurt expression on his face right away. "I apologize, I just know what I saw, Mike. She's real." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. "Well, let's do some research tomorrow. If there is someone on the ship who actually looks that much like you, other people must have noticed too." I agreed, grateful for his support even if he thought I was going crazy. We decided to meet for breakfast, and I went back to my cabin feeling a little better. That night, I dreamed of endless hallways lined with mirrors, each of which showed a slightly different version of myself. I woke up gasping. Sweat-soaked, the next few days were a blur of paranoia and futile searching. Mike and I asked other passengers, looked through passenger lists, and even bought a junior crew member's permission to view security camera footage, but there was no sign of my mysterious double. Other passengers began to stare at me strangely, and I heard whispers as I went by and saw people pointing and speaking in low voices. More than once, someone came up to me and insisted that they had just seen me in a different area of the ship. Mike stayed by me, but I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew what I'd seen, and I was growing increasingly certain that something really strange was happening on this ship. It all came together on the 8th night of the cruise, when I was walking back to my cabin after a late-night movie. Maybe it was just someone who looked a lot like you, he suggested one afternoon as we sat by the pool, and now you're just seeing what you expect to see. I was determined not to let her leave this time, so I ran towards her and called out, "Wait, who are you and why do you look like me?" She turned and ran away, and I followed her through the ship's winding hallways upstairs, through lounges, and through restaurants. It was like a maze, and I repeatedly found myself in areas of the ship that I had never seen before. Eventually, I cornered her in a deadened hallway, and she stood with her back to me, her shoulders heaving as if she had been running too. I gasped, trying to tell. "I'm you, Sarah, or rather I'm who you could be, who you might become." She turned to face me slowly, and as she did, I felt the world tilt sideways. Her face was mine, but that was wrong in some way. The proportions were a little off, the eyes were a little too big, and the smile was a little too wide. I watched in horror as her features seemed to ripple and shift like a reflection in disturbed water. "Who am I?" she said, her voice a distorted version of mine. She laughed, and the sound sent shivers down my spine. She said, "Of course, you can go back to your life, your safe, predictable existence, or you can embrace the unknown, become something more." As she spoke, I noticed something. "What are you?" she asked, her smile expanding impossibly. "I'm a possibility, a potential future. This ship exists in a place where realities intersect, where different versions of ourselves can meet." For a moment, I was tempted by the promise of adventure and the unknown, but then I thought of my life back home, where my friends and family were likely worried about where I had disappeared to. I shook my head. No, this is my reality, my life, and I chose it. Behind her, the end of the hallway was shifting, shimmering like a heat haze, and beyond it, I caught glimpses of other places and realities. She held out her hand, "Sarah, and let me see what you could become." She hissed and then lunged at me before I could react. I closed my eyes, expecting to be hit, but instead I felt a rush of wind and a sensation of falling, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my cabin with sunlight streaming through the porthole and the sounds of passengers enjoying the morning coming in from the hallway. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I noticed something on my bedside table, a small silver pendant that looked like a key. Looked oddly familiar, so I picked it up, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw myself in the mirror. My mouth was a little too wide, but I could swear my reflection smiled at me. The rest of the crew passed without incident, and I never saw my doppelganger again. Eventually, I was able to convince myself that stress and too much sun had distorted my thoughts, and Mike and I grew closer. By the time we docked, we were planning to see each other again in the real world, but occasionally late at night, I find myself, if you ever find yourself on a cruise and catch a glimpse of someone who looks exactly like you, remember my story and be extremely careful about the decisions you make, because sometimes our doubles are more than just reflections. As I look at that silver key, I wonder about roads not taken, about other versions of myself and other realities, and I can't help but think that somewhere out there on a ship sailing through the spaces between worlds, another Sarah made a very different choice. Voice. The words were spoken with such urgency and raw fear about who we might become, for better or worse, that I felt my blood turn to ice. At midnight, the weathered trucker who had spoken them was already leaving me frozen in my seat with a half-eaten burger growing cold on the plate in front of me. I checked my watch at 11:37 p.m. I'm Jack, and up until that point, I was on a routine cross-country drive from New York to Los Angeles. I'm a freelance photographer, and I'd taken on a last-minute gig that required me to transport some sensitive equipment that couldn't be trusted to shipping companies. The pay was good, and I figured the road trip would give me a chance to capture some interesting shots. As I looked around the diner, taking in the tense faces and sly glances of the other patrons, I realized with growing dread that I'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a late-night pit stop. When I saw the neon sign for Mel's Diner glowing like a beacon in the dark Nevada desert, I decided to pull over because my stomach was growling and I thought a hot meal and a real cup of coffee would help. The diner looked like something out of a 1950s postcard, with all chrome and red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner playing Old Rocket and our roll tunes. I had been driving for almost 18 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the kind of determination that comes only when a deadline is approaching. I knew something was wrong as soon as I walked in. The place was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night, but the atmosphere was tense, almost electric. I slid into an empty booth and ordered a cheeseburger and coffee from a waitress whose smile seemed a little too forced. While I waited for my food, I noticed that everyone in the diner seemed tense, that conversations were hushed, and that everyone was staring at the large clock above the counter. When my food arrived, I attempted to talk to the busy waitress. The trucker at the counter turned to me and whispered those chilling words, "Whatever you do, don't be here at this time." "Night, huh?" she said, nodding, her eyes darting to the clock. "Yeah, it usually is around this time." "Oh, you get a lot of late-night traffic." She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Look, honey, you seem nice, so let me give you some advice. Eat quick and get back on the road. You don't want to be here too long." Before I could ask her what she meant, she had left, rushing off to another table. Midnight, as he walked away, I noticed other patrons starting to leave. They moved with an urgency that seemed at odds with the late hour, practically running to their vehicles. I flagged down my waitress again. What's going on? Why is everyone leaving?" She glanced nervously at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Now inside, I shouldn't tell you this, but things happen here at midnight, bad things. Nobody knows why, but it's been going on for years. Some say this place sits on some kind of convergence, a weak spot between worlds. All I know is Gar, and you don't want to be here when the clock struck 12. I laughed, even though it sounded hollow to me. "Come on, you can't be serious. What's this place, haunted or something?" Her expression seemed even more serious. "Please, for your own sake, finish up and leave." I wanted to think it was all a complicated joke or some strange local custom to frighten tourists, but the fear in her eyes and the tension in the air felt too real to ignore. I gulped down my coffee in the car and threw some bills on the table, deciding I didn't want to stay to find out what was going on. But as I got up to leave, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The diner's door had disappeared, and in its place was a solid wall covered in tacky wallpaper like the rest of the place. I blinked hard, thinking I must be more exhausted than I realized, but when I opened my eyes, the wall was still there, and someone whispered. I turned to see the dozen or so other customers still huddled together in the middle of the waitress was among them in the diner, her previous poise eroding as she gripped a coffee pot like a weapon. "What the hell is happening here?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. An elderly man with a weathered leather face spoke up, saying, "It's midnight, son, or it will be in about." He checked his wife, and after 2 minutes they arrived. "Who are you talking about?" Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered, and the jukebox, which had been playing Great Balls of Fire, quietly, abruptly changed to the diner's temperature seemed to drop several degrees in a matter of seconds, and I didn't realize it. The old man yelled, "Remember not to look directly at them, and whatever you do, don't let them touch you." The group formed a tight circle facing outward, and I joined them without thinking, pressing my back against strangers as we huddled together. The waitress pressed something into my hand, a salt shaker, salt, and iron, and muttered only things that slowed them down. I wanted to laugh and tell them all this was, but the words got stuck in my throat when I saw something moving outside the windows. It was shapes darker than the night itself, flowing like smoke, but they had a terrible purpose. They pressed against the glass, which started to frost over despite the heat of the desert. Then, as midnight arrived, the real horror started, and the shapes outside seemed to come together to form vaguely humanoid figures that were somehow more terrifying because of their almost recognizable form that seeped through the cracks around the windows into the old man's voice rose in a chant of words in a language I didn't understand, and I felt a hand grab hold of mine and squeeze tightly as someone in our group whimpered. Others joined in, their voices trembling but getting stronger as they repeated the phrases. The shadow figures circled us, their movements jerky and unnatural, and I caught glimpses of legs that were too long, faces that changed and shifted like smoke, and the air thick with the smell of ozone and something rotten. One of the creatures reached out to our group. Without thinking, I flung the contents of my salt shaker at it. The thing recoiled with a hiss that sounded like radio static, its form dissipating for a moment before reforming. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I couldn't tell if we'd been surrounded for minutes or hours. My arm ached from holding it out, salt shaker at the ready. My throat was raw from chanting words I didn't understand just when I thought I couldn't take anymore. When the press of bodies and the suffocating presence of the shadow creatures became too much, something changed. The old man's chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly the air itself seemed to ripple. The shadow figures began to retreat, their forms becoming less distinct. They flowed back out through the windows, which shattered outward in a spray of glass. A wind whipped through the diner, carrying with it the last wisps of the creatures and the lingering smell of decay, and then as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, the only sound our ragged breathing and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. Slowly our circle broke apart. I saw tears on some faces, blank shock on others. The waitress was the first to speak. "Everyone okay? Anyone touched?" There was a general murmur of assent. No one, it seemed, had been injured physically, on at least, as if a spell had been broken. The diner burst into activity. People began sweeping up glass, righting overturned chairs, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy. I stood there, salt shaker still clutched in my hand, trying to process what I just experienced. The old man approached me, his eyes kind but weary. "First time. How you did, good son?" I found my voice at last. What were those things? Why here? Why at midnight?" He shook his head. "Wish I could tell you. Been coming here every night for 30 years trying to figure it out. All I know is they're getting stronger, and if we weren't here to hold them back." He trailed off his implication clear as the sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. The door to the diner reappeared. People began to leave, nodding to each other with the camaraderie of soldiers who'd been through battle together. I made my way to my car on shaky legs, my mind still reeling. As I was about to drive away, the waitress ran out, pressing a piece of paper into my hand. "If you're ever passing through again," she said, "and you want to help, this is where we'll be." I looked down at the paper. It was a schedule listing dates and times, a roster of guardians keeping W etched against the darkness. As I pulled back onto the highway, the events of the night began to feel like a dream, but the salt shaker on my passenger seat and the paper clutched in my hand were undeniable proof of what I'd experienced. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that diner. Part of me hopes I never see it again, but another part I'm still coming to terms with, knows that I will, because now that I've seen what's out there, now that I know what lurks in the spaces between moments. How can I not stand against it? So if you're ever driving through the Nevada desert late at night and you see a diner glowing like a beacon in the darkness, think carefully before you stop. And if you do, keep an eye on the clock, because when midnight comes you might find yourself facing horrors beyond imagination or standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the last line of defense against the encroaching dark. And whatever you do, don't be there at midnight unless of course you choose to be.